loved him. I'd have willingly laid down my life for Colin at any time, and I think it'd be a cheap price to pay. Because you must remember that when I was a boy, we were slave-minded, serfs. And anyone that come along and lift us out of that position, I looked upon with gods.
My love of Collins, I'd use no other word, hasn't altered one iota in the passage of time. He was always very kind to me and very understanding, a man of immense ability, untiring energy, and thoughtfulness for others. At the end of a day, when most people would look for a rest, I've known him to go around looking for the relatives of people who have suffered a loss to try and give them some comfort. He was a patriot, a most courageous man, and a great, great gentleman.
How did one man take on history's biggest empire in his 20s and free his country from foreign rule, only to be killed by his fellow Irishmen? This is the full life of Michael Collins. On the 16th of October 1890, 2 days after Eisenhower and a month before General de Gaulle, another national icon will be born on a small farm in Clonakilty in Cork in the United Kingdom. His father, also called Michael, was a ripe old 75, and his mother Mary Ann 35, when their son Michael was born the youngest of 8 children. Michael Sr. was 60 years old when he married Mary Ann at only 23. Michael Sr. was a staunch Irish nationalist who was part of the IRB, the Irish Republican Brotherhood. He was an intelligent man, being able to speak French, Latin and Greek, and of course Irish and English. He was an important teacher to his children on Irish nationalism, especially for his youngest son Michael, whose sister Mary once recalled, quote, "By the time Michael could walk, he accompanied my father, who, in his quiet way, told him how to become a man." At 6 years old, his father died, and this was the young Michael's first taste of independence. His father was more of a rock for him in his old age. He never overtly educated him or sang rebel songs like other family members. He was influential in his own way. He broke it down very simply for his children, and told them that the Irish land should be owned only by the Irish people. There's a famous quote from Michael Sr. on his deathbed, who said of his youngest son, "One day he'll be a great man, he'll do great work for Ireland." Although interestingly, Michael's sister Mary said she remembers their Uncle Paddy saying something very similar. "Be careful of this child, he'll be a great and mighty man when we are all forgotten." Perhaps someone's memory was playing tricks on them, or both men simply made similar statements. Either way, whether it be his father, uncle, or both, Michael was clearly destined for great things from a young age. His education began at Lisaverde National School, about 8 miles away in Rosscarbery, before moving to the local Clonakilty National School. As his youth passed by, it was clear not only was he a very physically active and sporty child, but extremely bright, quick-witted, and had a fiery temper. His schoolteacher, Mr. Lyons, was an Irish nationalist, fiercely passionate on Gaelic culture and Irish independence. Mr. Lyons made sure to pass all this down to his pupils, of course having no idea that one of his pupils would end up dying for it. As well as his father and Mr. Lyons, another personal influence was the local blacksmith, James Santry. Michael wrote to a friend years later, quote, "In Dennis Lyons and James Santry, I had my first tutors capable of, because of their personalities alone, infusing into me a pride of the Irish as a race." Michael Sr., Mr. Lyons and James Santry were the 3 most important men in shaping the young Michael's idea of nationalism. Michael was popular as a boy but was very wild. He would gallop around on the family's white horse, called Gypsy, and he would often pull pranks on people, and he loved wrestling. He was always full of energy, and would often burst into bouts of pure anger or pure laughter. He loved playing GAA, Ireland's national sport, and a Cork sport called road bowling, throwing an iron ball on country roads. He'd often play sports with his cousin of the same age, Sean Hurley, who not only shared his interest in sports, but politics too. As a child, he always insisted on being the leader of everything, and always tried to take charge. His cousin, Michael O'Brien, wrote he would, quote, "insist on running the show at Woodfield when we were kids, even to holding the pike when we endeavoured to spear salmon." One of his childhood neighbours, Eileen O'Donovan, recalled a young Michael playing games with her siblings. He was known to constantly start wrestling matches and playing pranks on people in their sleep, like pulling hair out of their leg or pouring cold water over them. There's a never-ending list of little anecdotes on the young Michael. For example, his sister Mary recalled one evening she was making dinner and went out to the back garden, only to find a 3-year-old Michael dragging up a bucket of potatoes he dug up by himself. His brother Johnny said he remembers one time he found a baby Michael curled up in a stable next to a horse. Michael's hunger for intelligence was evident from a young age. He started off reading books like Lamb's Tales in his youth, before working his way up to Irish writers like Thomas Davis, A.M. Sullivan, T.D. Sullivan, Thomas More, Banham and Kickham, which stirred up intense emotions in him on evictions and landlordism. He was found teary-eyed one day reading Kickham's Knocknagow. His favourite book was The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. One piece of material that certainly stirred up emotions in him was a newspaper called United Irishman by a man called Arthur Griffith, the founder of Sinn Féin, who would become very close to Michael years later. He began reading the United Irishman newspaper at 12 years old and wrote to his teacher Mr. Lyons that Arthur Griffith is a mighty force afoot in Ireland. Michael's nationalism was clearly brewing from a young age. Years later, he summarised all these foundational views that inspired him in his youth. Quote, "Britain wants us for her own economic ends, as well as to satisfy her love of conquest. It was found, however, that Ireland was not an easy country to conquer. We had a native culture, we had a social system of our own, we had an economic organisation, we had a code of laws which fitted us. This was nothing radical, it was simply the standard Irish nationalist philosophy at the time. Cork is nicknamed the Rebel County, but even more specifically, West Cork, by this point, had a rebellious atmosphere brewing for decades since the Great Famine, with plenty of built-up anger. The anger can be summed up by taking a look at the last Catholic eviction in West Cork, which happened while the owner of the farm was on his deathbed. The farmer's son was so furious, he grabbed a pitchfork, walked up to the evicting agent, and drove it straight into his eyes. The only thing they understand is violence, was the local justification. And it was certainly a justification Michael agreed with. His cousin Sean Hurley said one day as teenagers, they were walking down the road and passed the home of a local evicting landlord. Michael turned and said to his cousin, "When I'm a man, we'll have him and his kind out of Ireland." In 1903 he moved here, in Emmett Square, in the centre of Clonakilty town. Here Michael learned how to type, and his sister Margaret later recalled he could type as fast as he could speak. Soon enough he was helping Margaret's husband, Patrick, who worked for the local newspaper. Mary Ann was worried if little Michael stayed at home in Clonakilty, he might fall into bad company. He was head of his class, and I'm afraid he might get into mischief, she told Michael's sisters. So she decided her youngest son's future lay in London, and Michael was signed up for the British Civil Service. He applied for the Post Office Boy Clerk exams, and in February 1906 he took his exams in Cork City and passed. Of the 23 boys who took the exam, he ranked number 5. His best areas were handwriting, English, arithmetic and geography, though he struggled with mathematics. In May 1906, at 15 years old, he was called to take up a job at West Kensington Post Office in London. So he dropped out of school and said goodbye to his family and friends, and in particular, one last heartfelt goodbye to his mother, who was very ill at the time. So at only 16 years old, he packed his bags and set sail for London to work for the British Post Office. Collins moved to London and lived with his sister Joanna, who he called Hanny, who was also working at the post office. They stayed together here at West Kensington, and they would end up living together for 9.5 years. Hanny took on a mothering role for Michael, and often referred to him as one of her own. She often took him to meet her English friends, so he could understand English culture and how they lived, and help him further integrate. And although Collins was taken out of Ireland, Ireland was never taken out of Collins. His closest friend in London was his own cousin from Clonakilty, Sean Hurley. 6 months after he left home, his mother Mary Ann died at 52 years of age, though because of pressure from his new job and lack of money, he wasn't able to go back to Cork for her funeral. At 17 years old, he was now an orphan. Through his Irish friends, he joined the local GAA club, the London Irish, which he became secretary of and vice-captain at only 17. He played midfield and quickly became known for his hot temper on the pitch, just like back home. He was known for bursting out into anger, and as soon as he was finished, he would go back to laughing and joking like nothing ever happened. While on the pitch, he would often make fun of the Irishmen born in London and mock their English accents, but as soon as anyone dared to mock him, he would completely lose his temper and rip them to shreds. This is where he came into contact with a group of like-minded people who would change his life, called the Irish Republican Brotherhood, or the IRB. The IRB were a secret underground organisation of Irish nationalists who believed in Irish independence and promoting all forms of Irish culture. The same year, he took his Irish nationalism even further when he joined Arthur Griffith's new party called Sinn Féin. The biggest step Collins took in 1909 was in November when he was sworn in as an official member of the IRB by his fellow post office worker and West Cork neighbour Sam Maguire at the IRB secret headquarters in Barnsbury Hall. It might be worth noting Sam Maguire was a Protestant. There is no evidence of Michael or any of the Collins family showing any hatred towards Protestants, who were a considerable portion of West Cork. His mother Marianne had many Protestant friends herself, and many attended her Catholic funeral. A century previous, Wolfe Tone had a vision for Ireland to be led by Catholics and Protestants, united in the common name of Irishmen. This had not yet come true, but as we'll see later, many did fight together in the IRB and IRA. Collins was already familiar with the IRB, as his late father was a member. Through the London Irish, he was introduced to Gaelic League classes, where the Irish language, history and culture were taught and promoted. At a young age, he was already setting up the gears in motion for his life. He was clearly a man in a hurry. Unlike other teenagers, he was not slacking. He was taking everything seriously and pulling himself up by the bootstraps, always reading and getting involved in nationalist groups. In 1910, Michael left the post office and got a new job as a messenger at a stockbroker's called Horn & Co. On his trips back home to Cork, he stayed with his brother Johnny and his wife Cathy. He would often be found in the neighbours' houses, telling them about the progress of the IRB. Not gifted with his singing voice, Collins would entertain the room by reciting poems, and if the local musician came over with his accordion, Collins would grab one of the local girls and dance her around the kitchen. Back in London, he also went to the theatre and art galleries regularly and became extremely interested in painting. Being a charismatic, outgoing man, he was often invited to events and parties amongst painters, artists and writers. Through his social circles, he became friends with the painter Sir John Lavery and got to know Crompton Llewellyn Davis, who was a solicitor for future Prime Minister David Lloyd George. And Collins got to hear personal stories of Lloyd George, not knowing he would negotiate Ireland's independence with him years later. Here, his English friends introduced him to Dickens and H.G. Wells, and he became interested in George Bernard Shaw. He became such a huge fan of Shaw, he kept extracts of Shaw's The Man of Destiny in his wallet. He also underlined a passage in Walter Whitman's Leaves of Grass, which reflects his philosophy at the time. I exist as I am, that is enough. If no other in the world be aware, I sit content, and if each all be aware, I sit content. Meanwhile, while Collins was in London, in 1913 the Ulster Volunteers were formed, a loyalist paramilitary in the north of Ireland, founded to prevent Irish independence. With heavy financial backing from huge names such as Bonar Law, Edward Elgar, Lord Rothschild, and even Rudyard Kipling. In response, that November, the Irish Volunteers were founded by prominent Irish nationalist Owen MacNeill, and thus the first seeds were sown of an organised revolution. But for now, back to Collins. On the 25th of April 1914, he was officially enrolled as an Irish volunteer in London at 24 years old by his cousin Sean Hurley. Both of them were saving up their money so they could buy their own rifles, and once they managed to get their hands on them, they had weekly training drills at the German gym at King's Cross, using hired, sawn-off Martini Henry rifles. On the 28th of June, a man named Archduke Franz Ferdinand was riding around in the car when he was suddenly shot. When Collins read this in the newspaper, he had no idea this was a glimpse into his own future in 8 years' time. Once it was clear the UK was going to war against Germany, this triggered a famous phrase for Irish nationalists at the time. England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. In other words, while England's back was turned and distracted, Ireland had a chance to pounce. Collins also began taking evening classes at King's College to prepare for higher civil service exams, which he never finished. And on the 1st of September, he left Horn Stockbrokers to take up a new job as a clerk at the Board of Trade. 4 days later, back in Ireland, the Supreme Council of the IRB had a meeting where it was planned it was now Ireland's chance to catch Britain off guard and stage an uprising. It was now or never. And unbeknownst to Collins at the time, he was going to be involved 18 months later. In May 1915, he moved jobs once again to a company called the Guarantee Trust Company. Throughout all the monotony of swapping jobs, he always felt like there must be more to life than just sitting at a desk, and his destiny lay elsewhere. He wrote in his diary, quote, "However happy I happen to be in a particular job, the thought is always with me that my future is otherwise than among the facts and figures of money. Yet I do not dream of greater things, only the thought is always there." All the while, he was still self-educating, and his sister Hanny was always encouraging him to broaden his nationalist readings. At this time, he particularly enjoyed reading Hardy, Meredith, H.G. Wells, Arnold Bennett, Conrad, Swinburne, W.B. Yeats, James Stephens, Padraig Colum, and Oscar Wilde. His favourite to see in the theatre was George Bernard Shaw, his second favourite being James Barrie. Although Hanny encouraged him to broaden his nationalist readings, she came to increasingly disapprove of his nationalist activities, and shared her mother's fear he would get himself into mischief. While at work, he had a reputation for rising to debate of any anti-Irish jokes, even if they were in good taste or not. After his death, his supervisor at the Guarantee Trust Company wrote that, quote, "Only on very rare occasions did his sunny smile disappear, and this was usually the result of one of his fellow clerks making some disparaging and probably unthinking remark about his beloved Ireland. Then he would look as though he might prove himself to be a dangerous enemy." But also said, the staff, who were privileged to know him, would never believe that he could do an unworthy act. It's worth noting Collins never developed any knee-jerk anti-English prejudice. His hate was always for the British establishment. Hanny took on a mothering role for her younger brother, as she had no kids herself at this point, particularly looking over him when it came to drink and women. Frank O'Connor, who was in the IRA himself, says that unlike most Irish lads in London, he didn't seem to drink heavily, and assures that Collins was, quote, "shrewd enough to know the evils of prostitution, only at second hand through the works of Tolstoy and Shaw." But P.S. O'Hegarty, his Sinn Féin and IRB ally, gives a more realistic portrayal of a young man in another country with no parents. Quote, "Everybody in Sinn Féin circles knew him, and everybody liked him, but he was not a leader. He had strong individuality, clearly held opinions, and noticeable maturity even as a boy of 17, when he made his appearance in Irish circles in London. But his place was rather as the raw material of a leader than as a leader. When he came to London as a mere boy, he found a spasmodic association with a hard-drinking, hard-living crowd from his own place, and their influence on him was not good. Not that his wildness was any deeper than the surface. Behind it, his mind grew, and his ideas enlarged. His cousin, Nancy O'Brien, who also worked at the post office, said all the girls were crazy for him, and when he would show up at an Irish dance with his friend Padraig, he wouldn't even have to give the girls a glance, and they would all go straight over to him. Around this time, he met his first ever girlfriend, an Irish woman named Susan Killeen from County Clare, who also worked at the post office. Even after they broke up, they remained friendly, until Collins became engaged to another woman named Kitty Kiernan, who we'll see later. Despite their breakup, Susan still preserved nearly all of Collins's letters to her, including a 7-verse poem he wrote to her called The Hills of Clare in 1915. While Collins was busy maturing in London, great plans were being formed back in Ireland, and the IRB officially decided enough was enough, and Irish history was to change forever on Easter Sunday, 1916. As the First World War grew and grew, and more European countries got thrown into the meat grinder, many Irish nationalists were not happy with the thought of conscription, and of course Collins was one of them. He was advised by his family to go over to his brother in Chicago to avoid military conscription, but instead he went to Dublin, and through his contacts with the IRB, he had a meeting with IRB leaders Tom Clark and Sean McDiarmid. After the meeting, he was sold on his future, and decided he was not destined to be typewriting in some office. He was going to change his country's history, and so he was officially marked in for the Rising in 4 months' time. He took a brief trip back to London, where he gave in his notice at the Guarantee Trust Company, and told them he was going to sign up for the British Army and fight Germany, which they were delighted to hear, but of course nothing could be further from the truth. On the 15th of January, he told Hanny he was going back to Dublin to join his IRB friends, and she was shocked. She kept telling him, "They'll let you down, Michael, they'll let you down." But of course optimism is often a blinder, and Collins didn't believe her. Collins' time in England had come to a close. His life in London had been vital for moulding him into the man he would become, and if he instead stayed at home in the farm in Clonakilty, he never would have met all the men who changed his life. Speaking on Collins' time in London, P.S. O'Hegarty said, quote, "There was very little to make Collins of those days to give promise of the man who was to come," and, quote, "He was very well read in modern literature and drama, and keen to talk about them. You would find him constantly in the gallery. He was growing and deepening in those years in body and mind, reaching out towards every quickening and ennobling thing in life." So he said his goodbyes and left to return to Ireland, now 25 years old. Instead of going back home to Cork, he went to Dublin and lodged at a village called Kimmage in South Dublin, where he was made financial advisor to Count Plunkett, father of Joseph Plunkett, one of the leaders of the Rising. Joseph Plunkett was a very intelligent, well-educated man, who was even fluent in Arabic and wrote Arabic poetry. They got to know each other very well, and Plunkett would end up literally leaning on Collins's shoulder a few months later in the midst of all the fighting. The job paid him £1 a week and his lunch, but he needed more money, so he found another job as an accountant at Craig Gardner & Co. Most evenings he was working with the IRB and the Irish Volunteers, and they were training at Larkfield Manor Training Camp in Kimmage, where he practiced his shots. At this point, they all knew they were getting ready for the real thing in just a couple of months. This was not a rehearsal, this was real, and from then on there was no turning back. It was ride or die. During this short spell in Dublin, he also joined the Keating branch of the Gaelic League, which specifically sought to revive and promote the Irish language. It's hard to overestimate the importance of the Irish language and the Gaelic League to Collins. He called the formation of the Gaelic League the most important event, quote, not only of the 19th century, but in the whole history of our nation, end quote. Through the Gaelic League, he met men who would go on to become very close friends, some remaining close friends, but others turning on him later down the line. Maybe the most important man he met here was Richard Mulcahy, who would eventually succeed him as Commander-in-Chief. Like all revolutions, this had to be kept top secret, and no traitors or infiltrators could be risked. The leaders of the Rising were so paranoid and obsessed with secrecy, they even kidnapped a very prominent IRB man, Bulmer Hobson, the night before the Rising, when they feared he might reveal their plans and sabotage the whole thing. Even Owen MacNeill, founder and chief of staff of the Irish Volunteers and co-founder of the Gaelic League, wasn't even told of the plans either, until the very last second. He did not support their plans at all and told all the volunteers to boycott it, and the Rising ended up being delayed by 1 day. Many did obey his orders, and the turnout was much smaller than intended, and only around 1,200 volunteers showed up Easter Monday. Easter Sunday night, Collins stayed at a hotel in Dublin City with Joseph Plunkett, knowing tomorrow was going to be an absolute bloodbath. And of course there was a good chance he could die. And so Easter Monday 1916, Irish history changed forever, and Ireland and the UK would never be the same. In a shabby room at Liberty Hall on Eden Quay, Padraig Pearse, James Connolly and Joseph Plunkett held a final meeting where they unfolded their plans to the volunteers. James Connolly said, "We're going out to be slaughtered," knowing this would most likely end in failure. It's important to look at the reasoning behind the 1916 Rising. It might seem foolish for only 1,200 men to take on arguably the most powerful military in the world. Pearse had an idea of what he called a blood sacrifice. In their view, the goal of 1916 was not to try to defeat the British Army head-on or overthrow the Crown. Pearse's goal was to launch an attack so huge, bloody and vicious that peace was no longer a possible option in Ireland. They would go down in the history books, they would create martyrs to inspire future Irishmen, they would drag the Irish people into war, whether they liked it or not. As James Connolly said, Ireland is a powder magazine. It's necessary for someone to apply the match. While Collins was into poetry himself, he was not interested in this poetic martyrdom. He was there to win, whatever way possible. And this is what separated Collins from many of the other men of 1916, who were poets, mystics and artists. He was always a pragmatist, first and foremost, and not interested in optics or any graceful defeats. When the meeting was over, the three men lined up ahead of each of their units outside Liberty Hall, and Collins stood as one of the only men to have a uniform. At 12 o'clock, the young men marched towards Destiny, with most of their weaponry simply being pushed around in handcarts. Their basic weaponry included rifles sent to them by Germany. The troops landed outside the General Post Office, or GPO, bang middle in Dublin's main street, and Padraig Pearse read out the proclamation, which declared Ireland to be a nation owned only by the Irish people who were standing around looking bewildered at this point. Apart from the General Post Office, other volunteers also seized the College of Surgeons, the Forecourts, North and South Dublin Unions, Marrowbone Lane Distillery, Boland's Flour Mills, and Jacob's Biscuit Factory. The troops stormed into the GPO to seize the building and use it as their main base. The GPO staff were shocked and quickly surrendered. At this point it was official and there was no turning back. Despite the fact the police and military were caught off guard, they still managed to call up over 6,000 British troops, and the country was soon put under martial law. At 25 years old, Collins at this time was staff captain and served as aide-de-camp to Joseph Plunkett. He made his mark as soon as he entered the GPO. He poured 2 barrels of stout down the drain, remembering that many past Irish rebellions, namely Wolfe Tone's rebellion, had been ruined by alcohol, but the same mistake was not going to happen under his watch. He then took part in tying up an English officer who was in there buying stamps, but assured him that he need not worry, and told him they don't shoot prisoners. Most of Collins' duties were in the operations room, where the leaders laid out maps and plans, the hopes of which were beginning to fade more and more every day. He sorted out a fight between the London Irish unit and Desmond Fitzgerald, after Fitzgerald refused to give them rations because they didn't have their tokens. Fitzgerald, who later became Minister of Defence, wrote how, quote, Michael Collins strode in one morning with some of his men who were covered in dust and had been demolishing walls and building barricades, and announced that these men were to be fed if it took the last food in the place. I did not attempt to argue with him, and the men sat down openly rejoicing that I had been crushed. Fitzgerald later described him as, quote, the most active and efficient officer in the place. He made an attempt to remember everyone's names and addresses, and generally speaking, tried to keep everyone in calm and good spirits. At one point, someone looked out over at all the rubble in Dublin, before looking back saying, terrible destruction out there, Mick, to which he replied, don't worry, old cod, we'll rebuild it and the whole city in 10 years if necessary. He was also keeping officers informed on reports coming in from the women's division coming them on. Across Dublin in Bowen's flour mills, another unit was being led by a man who was certainly on the Mount Rushmore of Ireland, alongside Collins. It's impossible to mention Michael Collins without mentioning Eamon de Valera. Much like Lennon and McCartney, or Danton and Robespierre, their names are forever linked, for better or worse. De Valera was an Irish-American, born in New York to an Irish mother and Spanish father, before moving to Limerick as a child, essentially being abandoned by his mother after they got there. While Collins' mother and sisters doted on him, Dev had a much colder upbringing and did not have the mother's love Collins was lucky to have. A maths teacher by profession, his interest in the Irish language led him to join the Irish Volunteers, and he rapidly rose up through the ranks, and he was authorised to lead his own unit during the Rising. De Valera was the definition of Machiavellian, and studied the prince vehemently. He could be ruthless when he wanted to, as we'll see later down the line, but right now he wasn't half the man he would eventually become. Far from a man of steel, he was a bag of nerves. He didn't sleep at all the night before or after the start of the Rising. Eyewitnesses recalled a tall, gangling, 6'4" figure with red socks and a green uniform, running around shouting nonsense orders, like ordering trenches to be dug, and even forgot the password and nearly got himself shot. His lunacy rubbed off on the other men. One went mad and shot a comrade, to which he was then shot down in retaliation. One of his subordinates, Lieutenant Fitzgerald, tried to finally get him to relax and fall asleep, promising to watch over his men and wake him up if anything happened. Sleep hit Dev immediately, but soon turned to a nightmare. He began tossing and turning and sweating, and then, quote, his eyes wild, he sat bolt upright, and in an awful voice bawled, set fire to the railway, set fire to the railway. Once he got himself together, De Valera made his men swear to never tell a soul, and the story only remained a small rumour in some circles for decades. Still, when Dev was captured, he made sure to get some good propaganda when he posed for this photo, with his head up looking very stern and angry. Perhaps the most remarkable part of this story is the dedicated loyalty his men had to him. Dev made his men swear to never tell a soul, and the story only came out near the end of his life in the 60s. As we'll see later, De Valera had a hypnotic charisma over many, including Collins. By Friday, the GPO was in flames and had to be evacuated. First by tunnelling through the neighbouring shops and into Moore Street, where they found shelter. Revolver in hand, Collins led his men across the debris and gunfire while shouting encouragement at them. The London Irish Brigade had decided they were not going to surrender and instead fight to the death, which Collins found foolish and talked him out of it. One of the few times in his life he did so. Eventually the desperate London Irish laid down their arms and surrendered. The reality finally set in for all the volunteers that the revolution was going to be another failure in Ireland's long list of failed uprisings against England. Even though Collins began the uprising by getting rid of the alcohol inside the GPO, he numbed his pain with a bottle of whiskey he found in one of the shops. Padraig Pearse's former student, Desmond Ryan, gave this description. Michael Collins sat in the corner, a look of horror in his eyes, a pallor spreading over his face. Moans escaped him, and he huddled into his corner at every faraway sound. Mackin went swiftly to Michael Collins, and spoke to him in cheerful undertones. Collins looked up and back, stoical and impassive, with the rest of the doomed volunteers waiting for the end. Aside from the fact it was another failed revolution, Collins also had another right to be depressed, considering one of the men killed was his own cousin and best friend, Sean Hurley. Under all the bombardment of artillery, sniping, gunfire and flames, Padraig Pearse decided it was best to surrender, as fighting would only stack up more Irish bodies. And so at 3 p.m. on Saturday, the 9th of April 1916, Pearse ordered a ceasefire and declared surrender. Though it may seem unthinkable now, considering how loved they are, it's important to note the men of 1916 were hated at the time by a significant amount of the country. As they walked down the streets, crowds gathered to shout insults and throw vegetables at them, many of them being soldiers' wives and widows, whose husbands were over fighting in Europe in the Great War. Despite the fact the Irish volunteers had caused incredible damage and killed 143 British troops and wounded 397, they treated the Irish volunteers considerably well, and even the odd word of admiration and even cup of tea was not unknown. But of course the story wasn't all jolly, and the worst apple of the bunch was an officer named Lee Wilson, who treated the prisoners horrifically and got great joy out of their pain. He took some prisoners, among them one of the leaders, 58-year-old Tom Clark, and stripped them naked on the steps of Rotunda Hospital. Clark had a bad arm injury from the fighting, which made it hard to bend his arm. Lee Wilson took advantage of this and ripped off his jacket so violently the wound reopened, much to Clark's agonising pain. There was nothing the other prisoners could do but watch in anger. Liam Tobin, a 22-year-old from Cork, later wrote, "I looked up to him and I vowed I would deal with him some time in the future." Sure enough, 4 years later, Collins' intelligence network hunted down Lee Wilson and took care of him. But we'll get to all that later. All in all, the 6 days uprising racked up a huge toll. 485 dead and over 2,200 injured. At this point, Collins was not a well enough established figure to be killed, but the same can't be said for 16 other men. The only leader who avoided execution was De Valera, for the fact he was an American by birth. While in jail awaiting execution, Padraig Pearse wrote a prophetic letter to his mother, where he said, quote, "We have done right. People will say hard things of us now, but later on will praise us. Truer words were never spoken. It wouldn't be long before the whole country would rally behind our movement." Even though many did not agree with the uprising, they certainly did not agree they should be lined up against a wall and killed, and one hung. Especially James Connolly, who was thrown into a chair, like a piece of meat, and tied up before being killed. This was seen as pure unnecessary brutality by the Irish public. Suddenly, Pearse's dream came true, and their martyrdom worked. On the 1st of May, Collins was one of the 238 men shipped from Dublin to Stafford prison, and they were all put in solitary confinement for 3 weeks. After the 3 weeks were up, they were allowed to go out into the prison yard and mingle again. Collins, as usual, wanting to make the best of his situation, attended what was called a Republican University in the prison, which he graduated top of his class. He asked Hanny for any good books back at their apartment, and specifically asked her to send his copy of Heath's Practical French Grammar. Hanny noted that when she would visit him, he seemed to have gained such control over one of the wardens, he couldn't do enough for Collins. This dominating charisma over authorities would serve him well throughout the years. At the end of June, Collins, along with a few hundred other prisoners, were sent to a German POW camp in Frongach, North Wales, and over 2,500 Irish rebels were sent to various prisons across Britain. Bouts of depression were creeping up on him, as is evident from what he wrote to his sister Susan on the 27th of June. Quote, "I'm afraid I've lost my keen sense of the ridiculous. I can't tell you how small I feel sometimes. 'Tis all very fine for writers to talk about the sublime thoughts which enter into people when they are faced by death. Once, when I was in a pretty tight corner, what struck me was how much nicer I might have been to the people who had a regard for me. You were one of them. Well, I'm in that sort of mood again today. I don't know why." However, in Frongach prison, things began to lighten up, as he got to make friends with many more like-minded people and build contacts. He had more freedom to read and play sports, which he was noted to have excelled at, and on the 8th of August he won the 100-yard sprint competition. And of course he continued his own personal favourite sport of wrestling, though nobody liked wrestling with him, as he was always known to bite his opponent's ear until it bled. Here in prison he got his famous nickname, the Big Fella, which would stick with him for the rest of his life, and he made a great impression on many people. like the 16-year-old cafeteria assistant called Robert J. Roberts. The prisoners would take advantage of Roberts' youth, and one stole some cherrywood pipes from the counter, while the others distracted him. Roberts recalled how Collins helped him by locking the cafeteria door and searched each and every prisoner, and the stolen pipes were returned. Roberts was a classic example of how Collins would find any slight bit of authority, even as someone as basic as a young cafeteria worker, and butter him up for his own advantage. Collins later convinced Roberts to do him favours, like helping him learn Welsh, and Roberts was delighted when Collins said he told his mother, Marianne, all about him, and Marianne even sent Roberts a present, a tie pin in the shape of a shamrock. Of course, this is very strange, considering she died 9 years earlier. Collins obviously made the story up, so he could flatter Roberts into thinking his mother was delighted with him. His grasp on psychology was so incredible that Roberts remembered this 50 years later. Quote, Michael Collins was very highly respected, especially by the civilian canteen staff. The manager used to remark that whenever we took a problem to him, he always listened logically. That is how he came into contact with Michael Collins, coming into the canteen covered in mud with the crowd, and we objected and told him to wash their boots at the water taps outside. He just laughed. He had a great sense of humour, but was a very stern disciplinarian. He used to be one of the first to morning mass. He was a heavy smoker but could go without, proving that he was more self-willed than the rest. The IRB once again began networking underground, all across the prisons, and indeed outside too. Collins was elected head of Frongach Prison's IRB branch. However, on the other side of Britain, in Lewes Prison, a man named Eamon de Valera also rose to the top, and began making a name for himself as IRB leader of Lewes Prison. Collins and de Valera were always rising up to the top, wherever they went. Eventually, after a period of attempted hunger strikes, it was brought to the House of Commons, and on the 21st of December 1916, amnesty was declared for the prisoners. Collins and his comrades were now free, and on Christmas morning, he and his friend Garrod O'Sullivan landed in Dublin, looking to find their friend Joe O'Reilly, who was also a prisoner in Wales. Collins and Garrod burst in the door of his apartment to find Joe with his friend, and Collins being Collins, tackled Joe to the ground, wrestling him, biting his ears so hard they bled, before grabbing a bottle of port, and poured as much as he could down Joe's throat. Joe had to explain to his friend this was simply Collins' idea of having a bit of fun. That evening they travelled down to Cork, and they were officially back home. After a joyful day, Collins arrived home to Clonakilty to find all the joy instantly sucked out of him, as he walked in the door and found his grandmother had died that morning. That week he wrote in a letter to a friend how shocked he was to find the Irish people had lost their fighting spirit. He wrote he was, quote, not too impressed with the people here, and that the Irish people had become, quote, too damn careful and cautious. He signed off this letter, and all his other letters after 1916, with his Irish name, Micheál Quillen. After 3 weeks of drinking, he returned to Dublin, one step ahead of the RIC, the Irish police, who came to his family looking for him after he got into a fight in Cork City. His family said it was just police intimidation and it was all lies. I mean, of course. How could our precious little Michael get into a drunken scrap? That's not like him at all. When he got to Dublin, he wrote to his sister Susan that the national spirit was better up there, and some sort of atmosphere was setting in. After showing his worth in Frongach Prison, he was promoted to the Supreme Council of the IRB, and with his West Cork neighbour Sam Maguire, they travelled regularly to various IRB centres in London, Liverpool and Manchester to organise gun smuggling back to Ireland. Also in February, he was put in charge of raising money for widows and family members of the men killed in the Rising, and his talent for finance put him in an indisposable position. Raising money for the widows and families was huge for him, as he was now making important contacts, and his name spread like wildfire throughout the Irish nationalist movement. He was not just a foot soldier anymore. He was shaking hands, smiling, and getting to know all the important names. His hard work ethic impressed everyone who met him. His right-hand intelligence man, Joe McGrath, described him as, quote, a ball of fire, very quick on the uptake, rarely if ever missing a point, and a good listener where learning the job was concerned. Soon, elections were coming up in Ireland, and one man who made a huge name for himself was Joseph McGuinness, a 1916 prisoner still in Lewes Prison over in England. De Valera, who was leader of Lewes Prison, advised against this and considered it, quote, extremely dangerous and unwise, end quote, as his view was that the British parliamentary system should just simply be outright ignored. Collins, as usual, going his own way, ignored Dev and became involved in campaigning for McGuinness. This was the first time in record Collins went against De Valera, and for sure it would not be his last. In May, while campaigning for McGuinness, he went with his friends to County Longford, where he stayed at a hotel called Grenville Arms. He ended up becoming friendly not only with the owners, but the owner's daughter, Helen Kiernan. Collins was well used to being a charmer by now, and instantly set his eyes upon her, before finding out she was already engaged. He wasn't often turned down by women, and was devastated when she said she wouldn't leave her fiancé for him. Much to his disappointment, he instead fixed his eyes upon her sister, Kitty Kiernan. But much like her sister Helen, there was more drama to be caused, as his friend, Harry Boland, also had his eyes set upon her. They fought over her until eventually Collins won, and he soon had the love of his life in his arms. Likewise, Kitty absolutely adored Michael. They became infatuated with each other, and wrote letters nearly daily, hundreds of which are still archived today in museums across the country. A few weeks later, the Irish prisoners from Lewis Prison were released, including their ringleader De Valera and his sidekick Cathal Brugha, who would soon detest Collins with a passion, and the feeling soon became mutual. When the prisoners landed back in Dublin, they were received with tumultuous applause. Of course Dev, in Machiavellian fashion, ignored his own advice he gave to McGuinness, and instead decided to run in the election as well, in his area of East Clare, as he said the only way to gain power was for him to ride off the coattails of his 1916 legacy. He was right, as on the 10th of July he won a seat. This seat he kept for over 40 years. It's interesting to note, Collins did not decide to run himself. Perhaps he simply didn't have any interest in becoming a standard politician, and sought solutions by other means. Or perhaps he was simply too busy, as he was really beginning to take on the workload by the summer of 1917. He was noted by many to work morning, noon and night in his office, often staying up until the middle of the night, and only getting a couple hours sleep. By mid-1917, his three closest friends were Garrod O'Sullivan, Diarmuid O'Hegarty, Joe O'Reilly, Thomas Ashe, and Harry Boland, who, despite his heartbreak over Kitty Kiernan, was still Collins' partner in crime. Shortly after Dev got out of prison, he became top dog that October, when Arthur Griffith announced he was stepping down as leader of Sinn Féin to become vice president, and let Dev take over as president. Collins was also elected here to become a member of the executive of Sinn Féin. Both Collins and Dev rose up the ranks wherever they went. The fact Dev was the sole surviving leader of 1916 made him Irish royalty. The Irish rebels were gaining more and more confidence, sometimes too much confidence, in the case of Collins' friend Thomas Ashe, who was imprisoned after he gave a rebellious speech. On the 5th of September, Thomas Ashe went on a hunger strike in prison. The prison officers punished him by taking away his bed and his boots, and force-fed him. He died 5 days later on a cold, wet floor. This sparked a huge backlash and shocked the nation. It became a huge propaganda spectacle for Sinn Féin and the rebels. Irish nationalism had gained another martyr. Collins was invited to give a speech at his funeral, and after the gunshots were fired, he stepped up teary-eyed and gave a speech in Irish and English, where he said, quote, "Nothing additional remains to be said. That volley which we have just heard is the only speech it is proper to make above the grave of dead Fenian." This was quite underwhelming to the crowd. They expected something massive and theatrical, like Padraig Pearse's legendary speech at the funeral of O'Donovan Rossa in 1915. But that was Pearse, and his time was over. This was Collins, and his was just beginning. And this, once again, is what separated Collins from the romanticism of 1916. He was always a pragmatist, first and foremost, and cared little for optics. He was there to win, not to tug at heartstrings. This was a war, and gunshots said more than any words ever could. Collins' financial talent was just a beginning, and it was now time for him to delve into intelligence. In March, he met a man who would change his life, and completely turn the tables against Britain. His friend introduced him to a detective named Ned Broy, who was a whistleblower from Dublin Castle, and was passing on inside information to Sinn Féin since after the Rising. Broy broke it down very simply for Collins, and told him that the RIC would have to be dealt with. You'll have to Broy was not the only whistleblower from Dublin Castle, but was certainly the most important, and passed on vital information to Collins. Initially, Collins kept his contacts so distant and separated, they didn't even know one another. He used to meet whistleblowers Kavanagh and McNamara, and pass on the information to his Sinn Féin circles, without telling them where it came from. Broy gave Collins a deep understanding of how the police system worked. By this time, Broy had been an RIC policeman for 7 years, working for the DMP, the Dublin Metropolitan Police. Interestingly, at that time the DMP oath included, quote, "I swear I will not belong to any secret society, the Society of Freemasons excepted." As Broy pointed out to Collins, the mental training and brainwashing was intense over police recruits. As he put it, quote, "After 3 weeks training, a big change came over the simple country lad." Broy's first impressions of Collins were great, like many. As he put it, he was, quote, "the man I was looking for," end quote. Although he did tell Collins to change his outfits, and he instantly took his advice, as from then on, Collins was always dressed well in a suit and tie. It's noteworthy that Collins' professional look often allowed him to blend in and avoid suspicion. He often got through many British checkpoints simply because he was well dressed. One of Collins' favourite books was The Man Who Was Thursday by G.K. Chesterton, gifted to him by Joseph Plunkett. With one quote, he made his philosophy: "If you didn't seem to be hiding, nobody hunted you out." With the aid of Ned Broy, Collins began building his intelligence network and soon had agents and spies all over Ireland. The spring of 1918 is when the military struggle really first started to appear, as it was made forbidden to carry arms in Tipperary, Galway and Clare, and on the 12th of February, Clare was declared a military zone. Although it was not quite a full-blown war yet, tensions were building by the day, and many of the Irish rebels were flirting with the law. Collins was arrested in April after he gave a public speech telling the crowd to refuse conscription into the Great War. He was thrown into solitary confinement for 3 days in Sligo jail, and then left out on bail, which of course he jumped and went on the run. He would ultimately be on the run for the next 4 years of his life. As the First World War was still raging, Irish nationalists still had connections with Germany, and on the 12th of April, a man named Joseph Dowling landed from a German submarine near Galway, hoping to gain links with Sinn Féin. This caused uproar in Westminster, as they thought Germany was going to start supplying Irish rebels again, like 1916. Fast forward a month, on the 15th of May, Detective Ned Broy gave Collins a list of prominent Sinn Féiners and warned him everyone on the list were due to be arrested, including Collins. That night there was a Sinn Féin meeting, where Collins warned everyone on the list to not go home that night, including De Valera. Dev did agree at first, but eventually, perhaps not liking being told what to do, advised against it and told everyone it was safe to go home. Sure enough, he was arrested that night, as was Arthur Griffith and 71 other Sinn Féiners who listened to Dev over Collins. Collins went to Vaughan's Hotel that night, which was essentially his new home, with Harry Boland and Eamon Duggan, before realising the arrests were already happening sooner than he expected. He cycled to Sean McGarry, the head of the IRB, to warn him, but it was too late. McGarry had already been arrested and taken away. Figuring that lightning never strikes twice, Collins decided the safest place in the entire country to sleep that night was, well, McGarry's house. So he went to sleep in McGarry's bed and managed to avoid arrest. He woke up the next morning and began his new life on the bicycle. Collins rode around on a bicycle around Dublin in broad daylight, and his casual bicycle rides became the stuff of legends. He never held his meetings in top-secret underground bunkers. He always did it simply out in public, in various pubs and cafes. He was like a chameleon out in the open. Ned Broy's advice with dressing smart saved his life many times. He always looked like a professional businessman, and put with the fact he looked like your average Irishman, he never stood out too much. Not only was he like a chameleon, he was like a cat with 9 lives. His look sometimes was genuinely astounding. Aside from Ned Broy, another unsung hero of this time was his second cousin, Nancy O'Brien, who was so charmed by Collins, it said she was attracted to him. Eventually, she married his brother Johnny. Nancy was always there for Collins at the drop of a hat, and if he ever needed her, she would drop everything and run to his office and dash up a flight of stairs. She complained to him one day about all the stairs and the fact he never gave her lunch. He pinched her stomach and said, "Yeah, sure, you can afford to lose a bit of that." Collins' kindness is summed up in a story she tells of one day when he was quizzing her over a letter he thought she received, but she insisted she didn't have. Eventually, after wasting time looking for the letter, she realised she had it all along, which set him off on an explosion, and he roared in her face to the point where she broke down in tears. That night, Nancy was woken up by stones being thrown at her window. She hopped out of bed, walked over to the window, and there was Collins, standing in the front garden, defying curfew, trying to get her attention. "Listen," he said, "I'm sorry for what happened. I shouldn't have said it. I'm under the most terrible strain. Here's a little present for you," before placing a little bag on the garden wall. And with that, the most wanted man in the country ran off into the night. Nancy ran downstairs, out to the garden, and over to the wall. only to find a little bag of bullseye sweets. The fact that Dev, McGarry and Griffith were now in jail was an opportunity that Collins and Harry Boland certainly took to the max. It was now up to them to choose any candidates to run in the upcoming election on the 14th December, and Collins and Boland both decided to run. That winter, Collins was campaigning all over South Cork for the election, which he eventually won, as did Harry Boland. Not only did they win, it was a complete landslide for Sinn Féin, and they absolutely obliterated their rivals, the Irish Parliamentary Party, who went from 80 seats down to just 6. Sinn Féin won the majority in 28 out of Ireland's 32 counties, just bar up north in Antrim, Derry, Armagh and Down. A new nationalist atmosphere had swept over the whole country. In contrast to the establishment parties, Sinn Féin was seen as fresh and new, full of young idealistic men, like Collins, who was 28, even De Valera at 36, and the fact many of its members were revolutionaries who had been in prison for what they believed in. Sinn Féin's victory was historical, not just for the fact they were the first Irish nationalists to gain a majority, but because of their plans to not go to Westminster, and instead set up their own parliament in Dublin called the Dáil Éireann. Collins was one of the many Sinn Féiners who was unequivocal he was not going to Westminster. All this was aided by the fact the UK government had their eyes off Ireland and were busy with the Paris peace conferences after the First World War. On the 21st of January, Collins took his seat in the newly formed Irish Parliament, Dáil Éireann. The same day, huge news came out of County Tipperary where an ambush took place. 5 men, including the legendary Dan Breen, eliminated 2 RIC policemen, and although it was unknown at the time, this would later be known as the first shots of the Irish War of Independence. The next day, Collins was appointed Minister for Home Affairs. All of this was done in the name of establishing a professional, legitimate government, despite the fact no other country in the world recognised them. All throughout this, he continued to work in the IRB executive. His workload became incredible. Everyone around him was baffled how one man could handle not only so much work, but the variety of work too. Everything from economics, to politics, to military, to finance, to intelligence, and everything in between. He often had to deal with over 100 letters a day. Wasting time was a mortal sin in his eyes, which included drink and sleep, which he tried to do away with altogether. "I will be a slave to nothing," he once boasted. All the while, he was still self-educating and finding time to read politics, history and economics, cycling around Dublin conducting business, as well as making time for family and friends, and of course his beloved Kitty Kiernan. Not to mention the fact he would find time nearly every day to visit De Valera's wife Sinead and play with their kids, and give Sinead money if she needed it. Speaking of De Valera, on the 3rd of February, Collins conducted one of his most incredible stunts, when he managed to break De Valera, Sean McGarry and Sean Milroy out of Lincoln Jail over in England, by smuggling in a key hidden inside a cake. They were met by Collins and Harry Boland outside. Boland threw a fur coat over the 6'4" De Valera and put his arm around him so they looked like a couple. They passed a few British soldiers from a nearby military hospital who thought they were a couple and gave them good wishes. Dev then went to Manchester to go into hiding for a while. In his official biography decades later, De Valera completely dismisses the role of Collins here and puts it all down to Harry Boland and Cathal Brugha. Another important detail Dev gives no mention of in his biography is all the controversy around his decision to go straight from England to America right after he got out of jail. He planned to appeal to the millions of Irish Americans who could help out with the cause, and he even had hopes to meet President Woodrow Wilson. Dev's decision to go to America caused huge infighting inside Sinn Féin, as most of them felt like it only made sense for the Irish leader to be in Ireland, especially at such a tough time, where the chances of an all-out war against the British was growing more and more likely by the day. Dev eventually agreed to come back to Dublin and greet the nation, but he was still set on going to America, so Collins arranged to have him smuggled from Liverpool to Dublin. But it wasn't long before he realised a lot can change in 10 months, and while he was in prison, Collins had made quite a name for himself. When Dev got back to Dublin, Collins kindly gave up his office to him. However, many of Collins' contacts didn't notice, and still continued to call every day looking for the big fella. One day, Dev had enough of everyone looking for the big fella, and snapped to his friend O'Keefe, saying, "What's all this about a big fella? We'll see who the big fella is." Clearly all this talk of a big fella got into his head. That evening there was a Sinn Féin meeting where a chair at the top was left for De Valera, before he turned and said to Collins, "Let the big fella take the chair." When Dev returned, there was a split through Sinn Féin between the more radical accelerationists and the more moderates who wanted to do this all peacefully and democratically. Of course, we can take a wild guess which side Collins took. De Valera and Griffith took the latter side and said the public was not ready for war. Darrell Figgis described Collins' reaction at a Sinn Féin meeting. Quote, Michael Collins rose, saying that the sooner fighting was forced and a general state of disorder created through the country, the better it would be. Ireland is more likely to get more out of the state of general disorder than from a continuance of the situation as it then stood. As I looked on him as he spoke, for all the hostility between us, I found something refreshing and admirable in his contempt for us all. A few weeks after, he organised another prison escape, this time Robert Barton, when he smuggled in a file for Barton to saw through the bars of his window and escape. He began to realise this was a lot easier than he expected. A few months later, he arranged 6 more prisoners to be broken out. Seems like back then it was a lot easier in the days of no cameras or alarms. The British were shocked how this mysterious new man, Michael Collins, was building up an intelligence network so incredible it was giving MI5 a run for their money. So in the spring, they sent over a group nicknamed the Cairo Gang, a group of British military intelligence agents, sent over to combat Collins' intelligence network. Things were getting hotter and hotter by the day, and the gears were in motion for an all-out war. Despite Collins' preference to chaos, he still continued to take part in parliamentary politics, and on the 2nd of April, he took on another role when he was appointed Minister for Finance. On the issue of economics, Collins denounced capitalism and said it pitted Catholics versus Protestants. He did not envision an Ireland where the economy was the be-all end-all and trumped all other issues. Culture and nationality were always to be prioritised. He once wrote, quote, that object is not to be able to boast of enormous wealth or of great volume of trade for their own sake. It is not to see our country covered with smoking chimneys and factories. It is not to show a great national balance sheet. The real riches of the Irish nation will be the men and women of the Irish nation, the extent to which they are rich in body and mind and character. He attended all the Dáil Éireann meetings in April, despite the fact he was on the run for failing to show up in court. Efforts were made one day to arrest him at the Dáil, but once again his rock Ned Broy warned him and he got away. Also in April, Ned Broy took his dedication to Collins and Sinn Féin to a whole new level. He managed to smuggle Collins into the detective headquarters in Dublin, where Collins and his friend Sean Noonan spent a whole night going through British intelligence records from what was known as the G Division, the linchpin of British intelligence. Sean Noonan remembers hearing Collins laughing to himself as he read his own file, which said, quote, he comes from a brainy Cork family. Collins took one of the biggest steps of his whole life that night, as he now had the RIC's intelligence system laid out in front of him. He saw what he was up against and how to combat the enemy. Although Collins and the more radical types within Sinn Féin were looking to take things to the next level, the overall policy of Sinn Féin was still to do things peacefully and professionally, and they even attempted to be involved in the Paris peace conferences. Collins, as usual, wanting to be involved in everything, was part of a delegation that went to London to try meet President Woodrow Wilson, but they never met him. Wilson was certainly not insensitive to the Irish issue, as Ireland's political affairs were naturally global news by now, and the Irish Americans began to make their voices heard back in the US. But for now, this was not a priority for Wilson. On the 9th of May, the last Dáil was held before De Valera embarked to the US, and they also held an American delegation who stopped in Dublin on their way to the Paris peace conferences. The Dáil was interrupted by armed soldiers and detectives looking for Collins, after he made a long, powerful speech about British overtaxation in Ireland. They stormed into the Dáil looking for him, but he escaped from a ladder given to him by his friend O'Reilly. After 3 hours waiting in an old dusty nearby building, he emerged looking absolutely filthy. However, having a good instinct for propaganda, he sent O'Reilly to go fetch his volunteer uniform. Now looking dapper in his nice clean uniform, he turned up at the reception afterwards for the Irish Americans, and created an absolute sensation when he walked in the door. There was the most wanted man in the country, walking around in uniform. The legend of Michael Collins was being created in real time. Before Dev left, being ever so Machiavellian, he completely pulled a rug under a rapidly growing Michael Collins, when he told him his best friend Harry Boland was going to America too. Dev knew exactly what he was doing here. He was fully aware that Collins and Boland were inseparable, and what better way to separate them than to have an ocean between them, and Dev could whisper in Boland's ear over there and turn him against Collins. Collins pleaded to Dev that he needed Boland here by his side, but it was all to no avail. Sure enough, Dev's plan worked, as things were never the same between Collins and Harry Boland when he returned. Dev leaving was, in a way, the best thing that could have happened to Collins. It created a power vacuum which he instantly filled. Although Griffith was officially in charge of Sinn Féin, Collins was responsible for intelligence, and it was up to him to combat the growing increase of British intelligence agents landing in the country. And of course he would soon deal with them in his own way. He was also elected to IRB president that summer, although it was not publicly announced. Harry Boland's friendship also left a vacuum, filled by a very important man, an Irish-American, ex-British Army soldier named Emmett Dalton. Emmett's brother Charlie was already a trusted comrade of Collins, but once Emmett joined with his military experience from the First World War, he rapidly passed out everyone else and made his way into Collins' inner circle. Dalton would later hold Collins' dead body in the back of the car, leaving Beal na Blath. Tensions kept building and building between Collins' intelligence network and a growing increase of British intelligence agents landing in Ireland, and they finally spilled over on July the 30th, when Collins authorised his first ever assassination, when his men took out Detective Sergeant Patrick Smith in broad daylight in Drumcondra in Dublin. Although Smith was not part of the Cairo gang, he was from the G Division of Dublin Castle. Collins was now officially a murderer, and although he didn't pull the trigger, he did give the direct order, and blood was now on his hands. The British reacted by banning Sinn Féin, and on the 12th of September, the Sinn Féin headquarters were raided. Collins one-upped them, and responded by having another British detective taken out, the same day. This time, Detective Daniel Hoey. Clearly the fight was now on, and Collins was feeling braver and more revolutionary than ever. The extermination of Detective Hoey was also a revenge, as he was the same man who picked out Sean McDiarmid to line him up against a wall in 1916. Collins realised he'd officially crossed the Rubicon. Smith and Hoey were two thorns in his side, and now they were simply gone. But if this was to continue, it had to be done very professionally, amongst men he could trust. So the next week, to counteract the Cairo gang, he formed a group of 12 highly motivated, highly skilled men at a meeting at Parnell Street. They were known as the Squad, also nicknamed the 12 Apostles. Their main role? Getting rid of key members of the British intelligence. The Squad knew exactly what their role was. Therefore, it was only the cream of the crop, who were completely dedicated to Irish nationalism. The British intelligence network was renowned worldwide for its technological advancements and efficiency. Yet, within a year, a simple country lad like Collins had broken it. How? He was prepared to be just as ruthless as the British, and often more so. He had whistleblowers like Ned Broy and David Nelligan. He had men working in the post office infiltrating letters. He had men who were ready to pull the trigger the second he ordered them to. Vinnie Byrne describes the process. Quote, "We were all young, 20, 21. We never thought we'd win or lose. We just wanted to have a go. We'd go out in pairs, walk up to the target and do it, then split." Collins was a marvel. If he hadn't done the work he did, we'd still be under Britain. Collins would meet us from time to time and say, "You're doing great work, lads." There was no formality about him. Collins became the founder of modern guerrilla warfare. Being completely pragmatic, he realised they could not defeat the biggest empire in history head on, so they had to fight dirty. It had to be ruthless and straight to the point, pull the trigger and run. There was no point trying to seize locations like in 1916. The IRA would hide out in ditches and bushes, eliminate their target, and then use the vast Irish terrain to their advantage. Collins was so incredible at guerrilla warfare, he later inspired the future Prime Minister of Israel. It's also said Chairman Mao, of all people, studied Michael Collins' tactics. An old US naval study course called Michael Collins the most successful terrorist who's ever lived. The claim Collins was a terrorist has no basis in reality, however. He always targeted British officials. There's only a handful of isolated incidents where he targeted civilians, and even then, it's only because they were snitches. It's worth noting the Squad would often warn the British agents beforehand and give them a chance to leave Ireland. Detective Sergeant Halley was visited at his home and warned to get out of the country. Another, Constable O'Brien, was gagged and tied to the railings outside Brunswick Street Police Station, but was left alive. It was simply a warning. The Squad were not a bunch of cowboys, and they are only to pull the trigger in two instances: direct orders from Collins, or self-defence. The Squad were completely convinced of their moral high ground. From their point of view, they were just simply defending their own homeland. Vinnie Byrne, for example, recalled one time he went to confession to a great priest, Father Moriarty. I told him, "I shot a man, Father. Did you think you were doing right? Had you no qualms about it?" I told him I didn't have any qualms. I thought I was doing right. And he said, "Carry on with the good work," and gave me absolution. Towards the end of the year, 2 more British agents were taken out by the squad, Detective Michael Downing on the 19th of October and Detective Sergeant John Barton on the 29th of November. Collins was scoring open goal after open goal, but his luck wouldn't last forever. Soon Britain's patience would run out, and they would unleash hell upon Ireland.
I don't make any bones about killing. Anyone that comes into my house or my country and tries to take over by force, I'm going to kill him, and I'll use any and every means to do it. And I'm saying that now in the winter of my life. I'm at a week, an hour to live or a day to live or a year, and I am not one bit sorry for it, to any man or God.
1920 was the year war officially hit Ireland. The year soldiers, spies and politicians were eliminated. The year the Black and Tans and auxiliaries arrived. The year of daring escapes, raids and rallies. Bullets fired, blood spilled, tears shed, and everyone in Ireland would feel the repercussions of war. 1920 started off with a bang. On the 1st of January, 3 RIC barracks in Cork were attacked by the IRA, and similar activities were spreading in the next few days to Wexford, Waterford and Kilkenny. A couple of weeks later, 1916 veteran Tomás McCurtain was elected Lord Mayor of Cork, with Terence MacSwiney as his deputy. Another win for Irish nationalism, at least for now. In response to the IRA growing ever more ruthless, drastic measures had to be taken. The British sent over a paramilitary, who were quickly nicknamed the Black and Tans, after the colour of their uniform. The Black and Tans were absolutely vicious terrorists, responding constantly to the IRA's attacks on British officials, with open fire on innocent civilians, as an attempt to demoralise the IRA and Ireland's support for them. While Collins would specifically target officials, the Black and Tans would respond by targeting civilians. They numbered around 10,000 and were mainly ex-servicemen fired from the British Army, and often drunk. On the 20th of January, an RIC policeman was eliminated in Tipperary, and in response, something that would sadly become too common, the RIC shut up the town. Blatant terrorism on civilians would soon become a common response to any IRA attacks. The next day, the squad took out a high-level British official for the first time, the Dublin Police Assistant Commissioner William Redmond, outside his hotel in Harcourt Street. The next month, the squad took out another British agent nicknamed Jameson, who was a British communist. They took him to Grange Gorman in Dublin and told him his life was at its end. Jameson said, "God save the King, I would love to die for him," and the squad happily granted his last request. On the 16th of March, new Lord Mayor of Cork, Tomás McCurtain, got a threatening anonymous letter telling him to, quote, "Prepare for death, you are doomed." A few other threatening letters were sent out to prominent Sinn Féiners. 4 days later, on his 36th birthday, another RIC policeman was taken out, and at 1 a.m, McCurtain's house was broken into by armed men with masks, and he was eliminated in his bedroom, right in front of his wife. Collins was devastated by his death, as he wrote to the now new Lord Mayor Terence MacSwiney, quote, "I have not much very heart in what I am doing today, thinking of poor Tomás. It is surely the most appalling thing that has been done yet." If Ireland's new Parliament, Dáil Éireann, was to succeed, it needed money, and plenty of it. While Dev was in America raising money, it was agreed he would raise half, and Collins, being Minister of Finance, would raise the other half. So he went about raising a bond issue. Money was first collected from the easiest sources: 1916 veterans and their families, nationalist politicians, and of course supporters. Now, it's one thing to raise money, but it's entirely another ballgame to keep it safe, especially when the enemy has the best intelligence system in the world. So Collins had to keep it divided up in accounts plotted throughout the country. The British put one of their best men, Alan Bell, on the case. Bell was Irish himself and a former member of the RIC, and at 63 years old, he was brought out of retirement especially to go over to Ireland and gather intelligence on Collins' network. Bell was given orders to trace where Sinn Féin's money was being kept, and he was travelling all around the country and monitoring banks, post offices and houses, and within weeks, Collins' accounts were being shut down and bankers arrested. Bell was the first intelligence agent to truly give Collins a run for his money, and was soon clapping at his heels. To thank Alan Bell for all his hard work, Collins put the squad on him. 2 months later, Bell hopped onto the tram in Dublin when 2 of Collins' men, Mick MacDonald and Liam Tobin, dragged him off the tram, threw him to the pavement, and sprayed him with bullets in broad daylight. Decades later in the Sunday press, Joe Dolan described what happened, quote, "Mick MacDonald leaned over and asked in a very courteous way, 'Are you Mr. Bell?' "I am," he said, but he did not get time to say any more before MacDonald and Tobin grabbed him. "Your time has come," said Mick MacDonald, as they hustled Bell off the tram. There was a frightened look on his now pale face. I pulled my gun and told the tram passengers, "Sit there quietly and everything will be all right." I jumped off and watched in case anyone should interfere. Bell was hustled to the pavement. He was released for a moment, the last of his life. Tobin's gun blazed, so did MacDonald's, and Bell crashed down onto the roadway.
Without the brains of Collins and his men, we could never have got anywhere.
Bell's death was absolutely ruthless, but again it worked. Bell and his brains were now out of the picture. Despite all the people around him, the RIC couldn't find any eyewitnesses. The next month, on the 14th of April, the squad took out Detective Harry Kells. 6 days later, another one, Detective Lawrence Dalton. The British were now trying to catch Collins from every which way, and even began infiltrating inside Sinn Féin. They began contacting a Sinn Féin member named Henry Quinlisk, who was ready to give British intelligence all his insider information and lure Collins into a trap for £10,000. Ned Broy caught wind of this and told Collins he had a traitor inside Sinn Féin. The IRA found out it was Quinlisk, but Collins decided to keep him for a few wild goose chases first, and fed him false information to report back to the British. Eventually, Collins sent him on a false trail, and said he would meet him at Wren's Hotel in Cork. Quinlisk told the RIC in Cork he was meeting Collins at Wren's Hotel, and it was time to finally arrest him so he could get his £10,000. Quinlisk went on his way to the hotel, but never made it there. Instead, the Cork IRA left his body in a ditch. Napoli McKenna, who was Arthur Griffith's secretary, recalled, quote, "The event impressed me deeply and threw a new light on the bitterness of the struggle in which I was now taking my part. From it I realised how ruthless Collins could be necessary. He had played up to and trapped the Irish Judas." Quinlisk was given time to kneel and pray. His body was left with a note saying, "Spies beware." With control of Dublin seemingly slipping away, Prime Minister David Lloyd George completely reconstructed the Irish government in mid-1920. He appointed Hamar Greenwood as Chief Secretary, General Hugh Tudor as Chief of Police, and Colonel Winter as Director of Intelligence, 3 experts who could take down Collins's ruthless network. Following the Black and Tans, another paramilitary force landed in Dublin called the Auxiliaries, who were smaller and not as vicious as the Black and Tans, but of course still weren't here to play games. The man credited with creating the Auxiliaries is a man named Winston Churchill, who began taking a very keen interest in Ireland around this time. RIC men and British paramilitaries were now suddenly patrolling everywhere around the major cities, walking with their guns out and driving around in armoured cars. Many areas around Ireland were now military zones. The British were now making it a top priority to get all their very best men over to Ireland and stop Collins. By the summer, the pressure was growing on him. He was now up in the ante so much, he was getting his guns all the way from Italy, from Donal Hales, the brother of Tom Hales, one of Collins' close friends. The summer of 1920 saw the IRA on a whole new level. On the 15th of June, they took out Percival Lee Wilson, who humiliated Tom Clark after the 1916 surrender. Once again, it was done in broad daylight, this time outside a train station. On the 17th of July, Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Smith was taken out. A month later, Detective Swansea, who was blamed for Tomas McCurtain's death, was also eliminated Sunday morning amongst all the churchgoers. The very next day, an IRA ambush in Cork took out 6 RIC policemen. It seemed like Ireland was descending into pure anarchy. From the start of the war in January 1919 to October 1920, the IRA had caused incredible damage. Not one policeman, spy or soldier was safe. The IRA were scoring open goal after open goal, but it wouldn't last long. In October, another prominent RIC officer, Detective Brady, was eliminated. The RIC's response was to shoot up the local town and burn down the local creamery. Their acts were so atrocious it sparked a huge debate in the House of Commons, but it was all a moot point and didn't change anything. The same month, in Balbriggan in Dublin, the Black and Tans burned 49 houses, 4 pubs and a clothes factory and killed 2 civilians during a night of drunken looting. The following day, in response to an IRA ambush, the RIC shot up 3 towns, taking the lives of 4 civilians and many other towns were also looted. Sir Henry Wilson, who was far from being an angel himself and wanted Ireland to stay in the UK, wrote in his diary on the 23rd of September, quote, "And then coolly went out and shot them without question or trial. Winston saw very little harm in this, but it horrifies me." More IRA men were being eliminated, including Sean Treacy and Kevin Barry, who was only 18. It said in 1920 alone, over 200 innocent civilians had their lives taken by the British Crown forces, including many women and children. Not all of it was random savagery. Torture was systematically employed to get information out of the volunteers. Even Collins, with all his ruthlessness, never stooped so low as to torture British troops or agents. A room at Dublin Castle was known rather sinisterly as the Intelligence Room and became the stuff of nightmares for the IRA. But the torture was not confined to the walls of Dublin Castle. One horrifying story is told of Tom Hales and Pat Hart, who were captured by Major Percival on the 26th of July near Bandon in Cork. Percival, who was later humiliated when surrendering Singapore to the Japanese, was known to drive around the countryside in the mornings in an open car, taking cock shots at farmers working in the fields. Upon capturing Hales and Hart, he first ordered they be stripped and beaten. Afterwards, he had them dressed bound with leather straps, and a charge of gun cotton to be placed on their backs. The detonators failed to go off, and they were made to run around while being prodded with bayonets. They were then thrown into the back of a lorry on the way to the barracks, and again severely beaten with the butts of the rifles. Pat Hart was beaten so severely to the temple that he never recovered. When they got to the barracks, they were handed over to the intelligence officer, a fellow Irishman named Captain Kelly, who had them lined up against a wall in front of a firing squad. They told Tom Hales to hold up a Union Jack. Hales refused and was then beaten even more, so Pat Hart had no choice but to hold up the flag instead, while the officers laughed, taking this photo. More beatings continued for the both of them, until they were thrown into their cell. At 10 o'clock they were taken upstairs to a room with 6 officers, including Kelly and Percival. Kelly beat Hales with a cane, calling him a, quote, "murderous bastard," and then Hales was strapped to a chair, and his fingernails were ripped out with pliers. All the while they refused to give any information about Michael Collins, and suffered through more beatings and got their teeth knocked out. But they never sold out their leader. Finally, they were pulled by the hair to the top of the stairs and thrown to the bottom. Tom Hales eventually recovered, though he was sentenced to prison. However, poor Pat Hart suffered serious brain damage and died in a military hospital in England, mentally insane from that very day. It's quite amazing that despite the fact Hales refused to sell out Collins, he himself ended up turning on him later down the line during the Civil War, and was in charge of the ambush that took Collins' life. Collins never forgot the sacrifice Hales and Hart made for him, and even a year later, when he was in London negotiating the treaty, his letters to Art O'Brien show him inquiring about Hart's health and giving suggestions for medical treatment, and he would often find time to visit Hales and Hart in prison. Naturally, Collins tried to get revenge on Percival and organised for him to be eliminated by the squad a number of times, each of which ultimately failed. On the 22nd of September, Sinn Féin councillor John Lynch was eliminated by British agents in his hotel bedroom at the Exchange Hotel in Dublin. A month later, on the 25th of October, Lord Mayor of Cork, Terence MacSweeney, died after 74 days on a hunger strike. 2 Irish nationalists in power were now gone. By the end of 1920, the tables had officially turned on Collins, and the walls were now closing in. Many Irish volunteers had been tortured and executed, and a fear really started to set in for them. Many began to lose morale and dropped out. As future Taoiseach Sean Lemass, who was one of Collins' foot soldiers, noted decades later, the time the Black and Tan War became active, numbers began to shrink very rapidly. The enormous companies that we commanded during the conscription period began to dissipate very quickly when they became a different type of operation. The British efficiency and their superior numbers were proving to be too much for Collins and the IRA. The British had gained the upper hand and optimism surged, to the point where on the 9th of November, David Lloyd George famously boasted he had, quote, "murder by the throat" in Ireland. Collins decided there had to be one massive offensive to turn the tables, and that massive offensive was going to be a lightning attack to take out as many British agents as possible all at once. He planned a single operation that would take out dozens of agents around Dublin all in one morning while they were in bed. This all had to be done in a single operation, all at the same time, so the agents had no chance to warn each other and run away. Collins selected Dick McKee and Sean Russell to gather intelligence on them, and they soon began exploiting every available intelligence source. Letters were intercepted, informers contacted, even pub owners, waiters and maids interrogated. Sean Russell chose the 21st November for the simultaneous lightning attacks. Sunday morning had them at their most vulnerable. And so Sunday morning began, possibly the most iconic day in Irish history. Shortly after 8 o'clock, Collins' squad, along with a few IRA members, landed in 8 different addresses in Dublin. At 92 Lower Baggot Street, William Stapleton knocked on the door of Captain Newbury and his pregnant wife. The maid opened the door before Stapleton stuck his foot in the door and the men barged up the stairs. Captain Newbury hopped out of bed, still in his pyjamas, and tried escaping through a window, but was quickly eliminated, right in front of his wife, who was hysterical. As the squad members fled, Mrs. Newbury could do nothing but only throw a blanket over her husband's corpse, which was still hanging halfway out the window. Days later, she gave birth to a stillborn baby, and soon afterwards died herself. A few doors down in the same street, more squad members stormed into the bedroom of Captain Bagley, a British officer who had lost a leg during the First World War. Assuming the Irishmen were just after his weapons, Bagley handed over his revolver, but it didn't do him any good. Instead, he got 2 bullets to the heart. One of his assassins was future Taoiseach Sean Lemass. Next up was Colonel Woodcock at 28 Upper Pembroke Street. Paddy Flanagan, who was known to be absolutely ruthless, arrived with 22 men and turned the building into an absolute slaughterhouse. Flanagan took out 3 British intelligence agents by himself. Colonel Woodcock got 4 bullets to the chest and Captain Keenley's side to his jaw, yet both survived. Years later, Mrs. Woodcock said after the squad fled, quote, "Never to my dying day shall I forget the scene in the hallway and in the stairs where 4 officers had been shot. There were great splashes of blood on the walls and stairs, and bits of plaster were lying about, and on the walls were marks of innumerable bullets." At 38 Upper Mount Street, the squad's Vinnie Byrne forced Lieutenants Bennett and Ames at gunpoint to stand on the bed facing the wall, but I think he can tell the story better himself.
So we never asked any questions. We got an order, we carried it out. Whether it was right or wrong, we carried out that order. We went up to the hall door, knocked at the door, and a maid opened the door, and I said, "Could I see Captain Bennett?" Oh, she said, "He's in bed, so he's very important, I must see him." We brought down Bennett down to Ames, and I said to them, "You know you're British spies. You know the consequences if you're caught as a spy is death." I said, "That's what's going to happen to you 2 men now. The Lord have mercy on your souls." So the 2 of them were shot.
The young men were the most idealistic and enthusiastic, like Vinnie Byrne, who was only 19, and said he took great joy in, quote, "plugging British agents." Of course, it was not all heroic, and at the end of the day, they were still human. They did not take any glee in what they did. In fact, it took a huge psychological toll on them. Liam Tobin had a nervous breakdown afterwards. He'd become, quote, "gaunt, cynical, with tragic eyes. He looked like a man who had seen the inside of hell." And Joe Dolan recalled, quote, "Others turned to drink to make things bearable enough." Future Taoiseach Sean Lemass said he never wanted to recollect his memories with the men and be reminded of that brutal morning. As he put it bluntly, quote, "Firing squads don't have reunions." But perhaps the grim atmosphere of the morning can be best summed up by Charlie Dalton, who said, quote, "Knowing their fate, I felt great pity for them. The sights and sounds of that morning were to be with me for many days and nights. I remembered I had not been to Mass. I slipped out, and in the silence before the altar, I thought of our morning's work and offered up a prayer to the fallen." Sadly, there have been many more reasons to pray that afternoon. After months of brutal British terrorism, 15 minutes is all it took for Michael Collins and his squad to take down an entire empire. 14 British agents were now officially out of the picture, with a further 5 wounded. It wasn't long before the alarm bells were sounded, and Dublin was once again a military zone. Soldiers were patrolling the city with their guns out, armoured cars drove around, and no phone calls reached the outside world. However, it was too late for some who were at a GAA match in Croke Park between Dublin and Tipperary. The auxiliaries in black and tans burst onto the pitch in armoured cars and opened fire on the crowds. 14 innocent civilians were killed and dozens more injured. Not only did it instantly shock all of Ireland, but also the British people, and the news was reported all around the world. Once again, the entire world had their eyes on what was going on in Ireland. That night, 3 men were caught from that morning, 2 IRA officers called Dick McKee and Paddy Clancy, and another called Conor Clune. They were brought to Beggar's Bush prison, where they were brutally tortured and executed by the auxiliaries. Their faces were so badly mangled, they had closed coffins at their funerals. British propaganda justified Bloody Sunday by saying they were searching for Sinn Féin members in the crowd, and they were fired on first. Out of all the thousands of people in the crowd, nobody else said anything similar, and even if so, it's evident the black and tans and auxiliaries emerged without a single scratch on them. This also doesn't explain why civilians were also executed even before they got into Croke Park. A 10-year-old boy named Jerome O'Leary was simply sitting on the wall outside and was eliminated without any provocation. What emerged from all this was Colin's most testing hour. Many of his men feared to leave their homes, and many went into hiding. Future Taoiseach William T. Cosgrave was so terrified he took refuge with the Christian Brothers in the Dublin mountains. Arthur Griffith was arrested despite no links whatsoever to the event. However, the man in the eye of the storm, now the most wanted man on planet Earth, Michael Collins, refused to let himself be cowed. When other men failed to do their duties, he got on his bicycle and did the orders himself, and even went to Mass every Sunday. His motivation was a mixture of anger, revenge and righteousness. His dedication was always to the Irish people, first and foremost, and he risked his life every day for them. The next year in London, while negotiating the peace treaty, he justified the morning of Bloody Sunday to David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill, saying, quote, "My one intention was the destruction of the undesirables who continued to make miserable the lives of the ordinary, decent citizens. If I had a second motive, it was no more than a feeling such as I would have for a dangerous reptile. By their very destruction, the air is made sweeter. For myself, my conscience is clear. There is no crime in detecting and destroying, in wartime, the spy and the informer. I have paid them back in their own coin." A week after Bloody Sunday, on the 28th November, there came massive news of a huge ambush in Kilmichael in Cork. 16 auxiliaries were eliminated by Tom Barry and his men. Colin's own brother Johnny played a part in the ambush, and Collins himself was delighted at the news, and it lifted him out of his depression. It seemed like the Irish fighting spirit had not died out altogether. But he wouldn't have much to smile about for long, as 2 weeks later, British forces took revenge for this by once again choosing to target regular civilians. This time is by far their biggest retaliation yet. They rode into Cork city centre, looting shops and businesses, and eliminating civilians, before setting the entire city centre alight. Entire buildings were burned, and the fire brigade were stopped at gunpoint and forbidden from putting out the flames. There was nothing anyone could do but watch the city burn. More than 40 businesses, 300 residences, the City Hall and Carnegie Library were destroyed, both of which held valuable documents. The damage was estimated at over £3 million, about €150 million today, while 2,000 were left jobless and thousands more homeless. Hamar Greenwood said in the House of Commons, there was no evidence the fires were started by the Crown forces. Dismissing the fact is obviously blatant propaganda. We have proof from an auxiliary himself, who was so disgusted by it all, he wrote to his mother, quote, "We did it all right. Never mind how much the well-intentioned Hamar Greenwood would excuse us. In all my life, I have never experienced such orgies of murder, arson and looting as I have witnessed during the past 16 days with the RIC auxiliaries. It baffles description, and we are supposed to be officers and gentlemen. On our arrival here from Cork, one of our heroes held up a car with a priest and civilian in it, and shot him through the head without cause of provocation. The poor old priest was 65 and everyone's friend. Many who witnessed similar scenes in France and Flanders say that nothing they had experienced was comparable to the punishment meted out in Cork. Nobody was ever held accountable for the burning of Cork. 10 days later, 2 IRA brothers called Patrick and Henry Loughnane were brutally tortured and executed by the Black and Tans in Gort and Galway, which once again shocked the nation. Ireland hadn't seen so much death and misery since the Great Famine 80 years prior. Between Bloody Sunday and the burning of Cork, and many of his friends dead, tortured, imprisoned or in hiding, Colin's head was spinning, and he took it all very badly and was heavily drinking whiskey. Towards the end of December, De Valera returned back home after 18 months in America, and Collins was up at 5 a.m. to greet him. Dev's American crusade was a combination of success and failure. He raised $5.1 million, though only took around $3 million back home and kept the rest in America. But he completely failed in his other objective, which was to get an official recognition of the new Irish state. Dev was weary he would be arrested again and thrown into an English jail, but his fears were unwarranted. The authorities knew where he lived, but by now he had proven himself to be a standard politician. He was no threat. The most wanted man on planet Earth was Michael Collins. It was common for the Black and Tans or auxiliaries to burst into pubs shouting, "Where's Michael Collins? We know he's in here." But he was nowhere to be found. Nevertheless, the long fella was now back with the big fella. 1921 once again started off with a bang. On the 1st of January, the IRA staged another ambush in Middleton in Cork and took out 3 RIC men. In the wake of Bloody Sunday and the burning of Cork, Lloyd George, Churchill, Henry Wilson and Hamar Greenwood were now debating whether to officially introduce martial law to Ireland. Collins was also planning to take things to unprecedented levels, and he even made plans to kidnap Lloyd George, along with 11 other high-ranking MPs. Sure enough, the Irish rebels were slowly beginning to crawl out of the woodwork and regain confidence once again. 2 months later, another huge ambush took place in Crossbarry in Cork, once again led by Tom Barry and his men. The war greatly increased at the start of the year. Between January and April alone, over 70 British were eliminated. In March, Collins had his first serious run-in of many with Cathal Brugha, who was Minister for Defence, but more importantly, De Valera's sidekick. Brugha detested Collins with a passion and was always scheming his downfall. While Collins was busy working morning, noon and night, Brugha accused Collins of funneling money from the IRA to the IRB. Brugha was putting so much pressure on him and trying to turn people against him, he even thought about running away from the war in Dublin and going back to Cork to fight there instead. Eventually he was talked out of going to Cork, but Brugha wouldn't give up that easily. Brugha's hatred for Collins trumped everything else, to the point where he would even purposely hold up arms payments to make Collins look bad. Sean Dowling sums it up accurately, quote, "Cathal Brugha hated Collins like poison. It was pathological. Brugha was Minister for Defence, but never did anything. He continued to work as a manager for Laller's candle factory. Collins was so energetic that he usurped many of Brugha's functions. He was sure hated by him." Unsurprisingly, many said it simply came down to jealousy. While Brugha was busy resenting in the background, Collins had much more important things to worry about. On the 16th of April, the auxiliaries drove down to Clonakilty and got him exactly where they knew it would hurt. They drove down to Woodfield and burned his childhood home and farm, and destroyed all the farming machinery, where his brother Johnny was living with his wife and kids. The burning was carried out by Major Percival, who tortured Tom Hales and Pat Hart a few months prior. As Collins said himself, quote, "They knew where they could hurt me the most." His nephew, Liam, who lived there as a child, spoke about it decades later.
The immediate neighbours of ours and got them to pile in straw, and at Bain point they made the locals ignite the straw and stuff. And, technically they made the neighbours burn the house down.
Collins sunk back into a depression for a few days. With no home or family of his own, his childhood home in Woodfield had always been his anchor. It was the only place he ever felt truly home. But he didn't have much time to feel sorry for himself, because he wasn't the only one who was suffering. The entire country was. A few weeks later, he had a meeting with Tom Barry and Liam Deasy, where they pressured him for more ammo and told him it was desperately urgent. Collins was in regular contact with a man called Donal Hales, who was working as a journalist over in Italy, and was sending arms from Italy to Ireland. A huge batch of ammo was due to land in West Cork. The IRA waited at midnight for the ship, but the ship never arrived. Collins was now running dangerously low on ammo for the first time. Throughout all this, he made the huge mistake of not informing the brigades they were low on ammo. This might make sense from the viewpoint of keeping up morale, but in reality it was a fatal mistake that would create many enemies for him later down the line and lead to his death, from those who thought Collins unnecessarily agreed to a truce. On the 23rd of May, Pope Benedict sent out a letter to the world regarding his opinion on the ongoing war in Ireland, where he implied his support for the Catholic Irish. Of course, the Pope back then was one of the most influential figures on the planet. This was absolutely massive for Ireland, but it was not appreciated by the British, who wrote back protesting it. Collins, on the other hand, was delighted, and it's even said behind closed doors the Pope personally admired him. In fact, Collins was becoming so admired, even the British couldn't help but be impressed sometimes. Cabinet Secretary Tom Jones, who was Lloyd George's right-hand man, wrote to Bonar Law around this time, quote, "Where was Michael Collins during the Great War? He would have been worth a dozen brass hats." One man who was certainly not praising of Collins was Eamon de Valera, who was never a fan of Collins' guerrilla warfare tactics, as he said it was too unprofessional for them if they wanted to be seen as a legitimate government on the world stage. Because of this, de Valera planned his own attack, a direct hit on the Customs House in Dublin city centre. This was the first of its kind since 1916, and it was just as much as a failure. De Valera's stubbornness resulted in nearly 80 IRA men being captured and 5 killed, with millions in damages. The only benefit was his propaganda spectacle. In the first 6 months of 1922, 228 RIC men were eliminated and 96 soldiers, but it was far worse on the other side. In the span of 2 months alone, 317 IRA men and civilians were also eliminated. The IRA simply couldn't handle it anymore, and they were on their deathbed. More elections were held in May, which showed a huge political divide throughout the country, with a Unionist majority in Ulster, and a huge Sinn Féin majority throughout the rest of the country. It proved once again the Irish people were still massively supportive of Sinn Féin and the IRA. The Black and Tans and Auxiliaries' terrorism was not working, and the Irish public remained steadfast in their support for independence. It was clear that the more the British opened fire on innocent civilians, the more simply drove them into the arms of Sinn Féin and the IRA. Lloyd George was left with the simplest yet most difficult decision: peace or war. Henry Wilson and Churchill pushed Lloyd George to introduce martial law to Ireland, with Churchill pushing for a, quote, tremendous onslaught. Lloyd George, also nicknamed the Welsh Wizard, decided that war was futile. The election showed that the Irish people were not budging on the issue. They clearly wanted independence, and so a peace treaty was just over the horizon. The only problem was, the idea of a peace treaty was entirely subjective. On the 22nd of June, King George V opened the new Northern Irish Parliament. Ireland was now politically split. As the war was becoming more unpopular with the British people, David Lloyd George was eager to wrap it up. 5 days later, he sent de Valera a letter threatening martial law and said he would increase British strength in Ireland by 3 times, to force him into peace talks. As far as the British knew, Collins still had a steady flow of weaponry, so it was now time for de Valera to get ready for peace talks. And Arthur Griffith wrote up a draft of a peace treaty to send to Lloyd George. And so on July the 11th, the Irish War of Independence was officially over. Liam Deasy, who later led the ambush at Beal, said the news was received in silence, and the reaction was one of disappointment. They all foresaw the trouble ahead in trying to get Ulster. And while it was not in Collins' nature to be pessimistic, he certainly felt the same. The next day, de Valera went to London to meet David Lloyd George, and deliberately left Collins out of his coalition. It said Lloyd George had a map of the British Empire hanging in his office, which he placed there in hopes of intimidating de Valera. With Dev being Machiavelli and Lloyd George being the Welsh Wizard, they put up a good fight against each other. Dev won the propaganda war in front of the world's media, but behind closed doors, Lloyd George flexed his muscles and threatened Dev with an all-out British invasion if he did not comply with the British proposals. Lloyd George made his stance perfectly clear. Ireland would have an army but no navy. There would be free trade between the two nations, but of course, most importantly, Ulster would remain part of the United Kingdom. After a month of shadowboxing between Lloyd George and de Valera, he returned to Dublin on the 20th of August, and at a meeting with the Sinn Féin executive, he made a shocking suggestion that Collins should go over to London to take his place, while Dev stayed back home. Collins, Griffith, Cosgrave and others were shocked, and instantly rejected this. Collins pointed out he was a soldier, not a politician. Dev argued he had to stay home and run the country. Of course, this is very peculiar, considering he was away in America for nearly the entirety of the war, but now he felt it was crucial to stay in Dublin. So he held a vote in the meeting, where it was agreed Collins would go, but he still refused. Collins still taught the world of de Valera, and pleaded with him time and time again for the coming weeks he could not go to London. They both knew it was impossible to get a full Ireland. One night he spent 3 hours pleading with de Valera, where he told him his propaganda image would be destroyed. He said, "The important fact was that in England, as in Ireland, the Michael Collins legend existed. It pictured me as a mysterious active menace, elusive, unknown, unaccountable, and in this respect I was the only living Irishman of whom it could be said. Bring me into the spotlight of London Conference, and it will quickly be discovered the conclave which I am made. the glamour of the legendary figure will be gone. Dev sending Collins as a scapegoat to London is by far the biggest stain on his entire career. He knew full well from meeting Lloyd George that a full Ireland was impossible, and records show he even admitted it in the Dáil. So who better to use as a scapegoat than the second most powerful man in the country, the man who for years was clapping at his heels and threatened his power. Not even Napoleon himself could be so Machiavellian. In the end, it was a man called Bath O'Connor who convinced Collins to go, but only because Dev told O'Connor to do so, as he knew Collins would listen to him. O'Connor said Collins called to his house late one night and his mind was in agony. He wouldn't sit down, but kept pacing up and down the floor, saying it was De Valera's job, not his. He was a soldier, Dev was the politician. But Collins eventually agreed to go, persuaded by Bath O'Connor. Years later, De Valera secretly admitted to a man called Joe McGarty in a letter for Your Eyes Only that he purposefully handpicked a delegation, specifically to create division. Distress was growing on Collins, and he sought comfort in his old friend Harry Boland, writing of the atmosphere in Dublin, quote, "There's something about which I don't like, and I have the impression the whole thing is pressing on me. I find myself looking at friends as if they are enemies. I mention no names. After all, it may be a wrong impression, but that's got into me. Frankly though, I don't care for things as they are now." Before he left, he made sure to get one very important thing out of the way. On the 8th of October, he got engaged to the love of his life, Kitty Kiernan, although of course it was kept a secret. A man in Collins' position had to keep his loved one safe at all times. The next day, the Irish delegation set sail to London to negotiate the most famous piece of paper in Irish history. On the 11th of October, the first meeting was held in Downing Street, where dozens of Irish people were kneeling outside in prayer, and priests and nuns were reciting the rosary. At 11 o'clock, a 29-year-old Michael Collins sat down to face political titans like David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill, who had been doing this since before he was born. Not too long ago, he was working at a post office in London, and now he was back, staring down men who ruled over a quarter of the world. With all his Irish charm, he managed to build an extraordinary friendship with many of his adversaries, many of whom wanted him dead just a few months prior. His closest friend on the opposite side was Lord Birkenhead, who he bonded with over the love of sports and women. Lord Londonderry was also impressed after meeting Collins, saying it was one of the most delightful meetings he ever had in his whole life, and he was not like how the newspapers made him out to be. The British clearly had the upper hand here. They were playing in their home stadium and had decades worth of diplomatic experience. Across the table was the Irishmen's first ever introduction to diplomacy. The British also had the upper hand, as MI5 were now aware of the split forming in Sinn Féin over what was a realistic peace treaty and the impossibly high expectations. In the first 2 weeks, 7 meetings took place, and somewhere along the line it was agreed only Collins and Griffith would go alone in the meetings. So now it was down to 4 men, 2 Irish versus 2 British. Many of the Irish diplomats were not happy with this. As Robert Barton said, from the moment Griffith and Collins met Lloyd George and Chamberlain alone, their power to resist weakened. They became almost pro-British in their arguments, and Barton felt like he had to fight Collins and Griffith first, and the English afterwards. But Collins was an able negotiator in his own way. During one of the committee meetings, Churchill was arguing some carefully scripted points, while the Irish delegation remained silent. After listening for too long, Collins suddenly lost his patience, and slammed his fist on the table, shouting, "For Christ's sakes, come to the point!" Churchill sat there, speechless and stunned. Collins then burst into laughter, which Churchill, in spite of himself, joined in on. Within the first week, Collins told Griffith he was not happy with his friend Diarmuid O'Hegarty, and he was sent back to Dublin. Instead, he subbed in his teammates, Emmett Dalton, Ginger O'Connell, and Owen O'Duffy, or Oney as he called him. Incidentally, Collins regarded Owen O'Duffy as his successor. On the 1st of November, something very interesting happened, when Collins and Griffith were invited to Churchill's house at 9:30 p.m. to meet Churchill, Lloyd George and Birkenhead. Griffith and Lloyd George went upstairs for about 45 minutes, which left Collins alone downstairs with Birkenhead and Churchill, and afterwards all 5 spoke together downstairs. What exactly was said in those 4 walls amongst the 5 men we shall never know, but it certainly would have been fascinating to have been a fly on the wall. It clearly had some impact, as everything changed from that night onwards. As one historian described it, this was something of a turning point for Collins. The only thing Griffith said afterwards was that Lloyd George heavily implied the only 2 options for Ireland were peace or war. Of course, it was carefully handcrafted that the old, tired Griffith would go upstairs, surely no match for the Welsh wizard, while Collins would stay downstairs with his buddy Lord Birkenhead. Lloyd George would find it easier to whisper in Griffith's ear rather than Collins, who couldn't stand him. Collins saw right through Lloyd George's fake acting. As he told his friend Robert Barton, Lloyd George was particularly obnoxious. He couldn't stand when Lloyd George would throw his arm around his shoulder and act like his old friend. Collins knew that Lloyd George wanted him dead just a few months prior. He knew it was all an act. The next week, Collins kept lowering his bar, and he changed his mind on Ireland taking a Dominion status like Canada, and said to Griffith that being a Dominion status in the British Empire would still be an advantage. As he put it in his own famous words, it was, quote, a stepping stone. This summed up Collins' psychology for most of the treaty. They would grab what they could get now as a bargain, and let the British win the battle, but Ireland would win the war and have the last laugh later down the line. Of course, considering they were negotiating with the second most powerful country in the world, with little ammo left, Collins and Griffith were not in the position to be fussy. Regular contact was also kept back home with De Valera and the rest of Sinn Féin through letters and visits back and forth, although Collins was annoyed with the lack of communication. In mid-November, Kitty and her sister came over to London to visit him, where he treated her to London's best clothes shops. Throughout his time in London, Collins and Kitty wrote to each other every day, and Collins also lit a candle for her daily. Some of their letters show how madly in love they were with each other. She once wrote about wishing how she could be with him to make, quote, sacred and profane love. And she did get her profane love later that month when she visited, and she said it was like a wedding night. In one intimate letter, she said, madly passionate in love with you, to use your own words. I found myself promising you faithfully that I'd never have a real row, nor fall out with you at all, no matter what you did. If first you were sympathetic to me, now don't laugh because I'm real serious. If you were not too rough, and don't hurt me when we were just playing. Just fooling and a few other little ifs. Kitty truly loved Michael more than anything else. All in all, Collins and Griffith attended 24 meetings with Lloyd George, Birkenhead and Churchill, and at least 9 informal meetings. Therefore, whether your view is negative or positive, these two men right here are the two Irishmen most responsible for pouring the foundations of modern Irish politics. The treaty was certainly the definition of a bargain, and not what Padraig Pearse dreamed of. It was agreed Ireland would have a Dominion status in the British Empire, somewhat similar to Canada, with the King remaining head of Ireland on paper. Dáil Éireann meetings would open with a swearing of allegiance to the King, and most importantly, Ulster would remain part of the United Kingdom. Lloyd George's patience was wearing thin, and wasn't waiting any longer for the Irish delegation to sign. Just like he did to De Valera, he threatened an all-out British war in Ireland in 3 days if the treaty was not signed. On the 5th December, he held up 2 envelopes to them, saying, here are the alternative letters which I prepared. We must have your answer by 10 p.m. tonight. You can have until then, but no longer, to decide whether you want peace or war in your country. Collins was absolutely furious. As Churchill famously wrote, quote, Michael Collins rose, looking as though he's going to shoot someone, preferably himself. In all my life, I've never seen so much pain and suffering in restraint. Later on, Griffith's secretary, Napoli McKenna, recalled Collins' stress was sky high. She said he was like a wild beast, pacing up and down the room before he plumped down in the chair and took a quick nap. She felt terrible for him. The treaty was not exactly what so many men died for, but Collins and Griffith did not have much of a choice. Collins, always being the pragmatist, saw it as the freedom to achieve freedom. Back in Dublin, British agents and auxiliaries had already begun to reappear on the streets. Either the British were preparing for war already, or just making threats. Either way, the walls were closing in, and the treaty had to be signed. Later that evening, he visited his old friends, Sir John Lavery and his wife Hazel. Lavery recalled how Collins, quote, lost his temper, but after, quote, hours of persuasion, Lady Hazel managed to calm him down, before she drove him to 10 Downing Street and he gave in. And so on the 6th of December, the final meeting was held. The Irish and British statesmen met for the last time, and at 2:30 a.m, after many last-minute arguments, redrafting and retyping, the most famous piece of paper in Irish history was signed. As they walked out of 10 Downing Street, Lord Birkenhead turned to his Irish friend and said, I may have signed my political death warrant. Collins replied with perhaps his most iconic quote, I may have signed my actual death warrant. After signing the treaty, he returned back to the Lavery's house, where he was able to somewhat calm down. He then returned to his hotel, where he once again went into a frenzy, unable to relax, nor able to sleep, as he was having nightmares about what was to come. In the middle of the night, he wrote to his friend John O'Kane back home, quote, will anyone be satisfied at the bargain? A bullet might have just done the job 5 years ago. Traitor was the nicest word shouted from half the Dáil when the Irish delegation returned, with some saying Collins was drunk when he signed the treaty and was too busy in bed with English women, some saying he was going to marry Princess Mary. Collins cut through all these accusations in typical Collins form and announced straight to the point he had no interest in English women because he was now engaged, although he didn't mention Kitty's name. Speaking of Kitty, Harry Boland's initial reaction to the treaty was positive, but he quickly switched to De Valera's anti-treaty camp and opposed it. Either way, the details didn't matter, because now Collins had lost his best friend. Harry Boland was now anti-treaty. After a couple of weeks of fighting, the climax came on the 7th of January, and the entire Dáil came tumbling down, starting with Cathal Brugha, who launched a horrible attack on Collins, saying he took no active part in fighting all throughout the war, and the press had turned him into a, quote, romantic figure. Arthur Griffith jumped to Collins' defence and launched one of the greatest speeches in Irish history, saying Collins was the man who made the situation in the first place, the man who worked from 6 in the morning until 2 the next morning. He finished off his speech by saying, quote, "If my name is to go down in history, I want it associated with the name of Michael Collins." This speech absolutely brought the house down, and it was some time before anyone could even continue. De Valera tried to have the final word throughout all the applause, before Collins, riding off Griffith's momentum, interrupted him and proposed a vote to cut through all the nonsense. And so voting began, starting alphabetically with Collins. The result was 64 versus 57 in favour of the treaty. The majority were on Collins' side, which led De Valera to announce he was resigning. Collins pleaded with him to stay to maintain order, knowing how much of a massive step this would be in the wrong direction, but he wouldn't listen. Dev began his resignation speech by talking about the glorious accomplishments they had made in the last 4 years, but couldn't control his emotions and broke down crying in the middle of his speech. Around the Dáil, women were crying and many men biting their lips trying not to. Collins looked over at his old friend Harry Boland, and both men had tears in their eyes.
But I would never fall out with Michael Collins about it. I stayed friendly with him all the time, but the treaty to me was negation of everything I was stood for. I wasn't going to be compelled to give allegiance to any foreign king.
The anti-treatyites followed Dev out of the Dáil, and so on the 14th of January, Arthur Griffith became the new president of the Dáil Éireann, with Collins as chairman and Minister of Finance. Collins' first major task was 2 days later, with the official handing over of Dublin Castle from the British government to the new Irish one. Where legend has it, Collins showed up a bit late, and the Viceroy said to him, "You were 7 minutes late," to which Collins replied, "We've been waiting 700 years, you can have your 7 minutes." As British soldiers were leaving their army barracks all over Ireland, they were quickly being replaced by either pro-treaty or anti-treaty factions of the military. Many fights, skirmishes and shots were fired as they went in to try to take over the empty barracks, and the gears were already in motion for a civil war. Collins' anti-treaty friends pleaded with him to tear up the treaty and unite the IRA, and they would resume fighting with the British, but Collins refused. He said it was the best they could get right now, and it was a stepping stone for the future. The anti-treatyites saw themselves as the underdogs due to less money and arms, and began to make their presence felt. Pro-treaty meetings were often broken up, and the roads were blocked with cut-down trees or dug trenches. And in March, Collins was humiliated when anti-treaty troops stopped him from attending an anti-treaty soldier's funeral. He also held a speech in Cork to over 50,000 people before it was broken up by anti-treaty forces firing gunshots to scare away the crowd. De Valera was accelerating the tensions with his reckless rhetoric. On St. Patrick's Day, he gave a public speech where he said the anti-treaty volunteers would, quote, "have to wade through Irish blood, through the blood of the soldiers of the Irish government, and through, perhaps, the blood of the members of the government in order to get Irish freedom," end quote. Dev would often engage in this reckless behaviour around this time, but always from a distance. An army council for the anti-treaty side was set up with Liam Lynch as chief of staff, and there were now officially 2 armies in the country. Brother was now turning on brother in just a matter of weeks. Collins told Bat O'Connor if a civil war did kick off, he was going to fight out in the open, but only down in his home county of Cork, not in Dublin, and so Collins returned to his home soil of Cork. But things were brutal for the Catholics up in the new Northern Ireland. Thousands of Catholics were being burned out of their homes, fired from their jobs, beaten and killed. Collins and Richard Mulcahy were working in cooperation with the anti-treatyites to send arms into Ulster to help the Catholics. The new leader of Northern Ireland, Sir James Craig, signed a peace agreement with Collins on the 30th of March, with both fingers crossed behind their backs. Winston Churchill declared in the House of Commons, quote, "Peace is today declared." Churchill's declared peace was far from the truth, as Ulster was being cleansed of Catholics. Tensions were building rapidly by the day between the pro-treatyites and the anti-treatyites. On the 10th of April, Collins wrote to Kitty, quote, "Things are rapidly becoming as bad as they can be, and the country has before it what may be the worst period yet. They go on from cutting a tree to cutting a railway line, then firing at a barrack, then to firing at a lorry, and so on. But God knows, I do not want you to be worrying about these things." And he was right. 5 days later, tensions finally boiled over when hundreds of anti-treaty troops, led by Rory O'Connor, seized the forecourts in Dublin, despite Liam Lynch, the leader of the anti-treaty army, being opposed to it. They also seized control of other Dublin centres, such as the Fowler Hall, Kilmainham Jail, and interestingly, the Freemasons Hall. They also raided Bank of Ireland branches and stole more than £230,000. Rory O'Connor and Ernie O'Malley were the driving forces behind seizing the Dublin buildings, trying to reenact 1916, hoping Collins and the pro-treaty forces would fire first. But like with most wars, nobody wanted to fire the first shots and get the blame. Churchill and other British politicians saw the anti-treaty troops seizing Dublin buildings as an act of rebellion against the treaty and the new Irish government. And he told Collins he would send over British weaponry for the pro-treaty side to use, or send British troops over to do it themselves. Essentially, Collins had the choice of using weaponry on his own brothers, or bringing the British back to do it instead. Ireland was officially in civil war. The Irish Civil War was a unique one, a fight between one side who wanted to continue fighting, and the other side fighting to stop more fighting. The anti-treaty side wanted to gain the whole of Ireland, while the pro-treaty side wanted to stop ahead and avoid triggering another war with the British. The Irish Civil War was not simply one of geography like the US Civil War. It cut right through cities, towns and homes. Neighbour turned on neighbour, son on father, and brother on brother. Most famously were the Hales brothers, Tom and Sean Hales, who were neighbours of Collins in West Cork. But when the treaty was announced, Sean and Tom couldn't find any common ground, and the brothers turned on each other, with Sean being killed that November, and Tom eventually organising the ambush that took Collins' life at Ballinablaw. But even Tom Hale said years later if De Valera signed the treaty instead of Collins, Collins would have been anti-treaty, and there would have been no civil war. Collins and Richard Mulcahy were hesitant to act quickly to Churchill's demands, and did everything to avoid all-out confrontation, and assured Churchill they would sort it out quickly themselves. Towards the end of the month, the Archbishop of Dublin, Father Byrne, organised a meeting between De Valera, Cathal Brugha, and Collins and Griffith, which was spoiled by Brugha starting a fight by calling the two of them British agents. Collins fought back, and the two nearly came to blows, while old De Valera and Griffith sat back in silence. Nonetheless, Collins and De Valera eventually agreed to sign a pact, where the treaty would no longer be an issue, and they would not run candidates against each other in the upcoming election. This was fragile at best, but any cooperation was a positive by this point. Churchill was not a fan of this pact, and wrote a letter to Collins disavowing it, which he ignored. A month later, Collins and Dev met again at UCD College in Dublin, and began 3-day negotiations. On the third day, after he signed the pact, Collins wrote a note to himself, quote, "Above all, Ulster." The anti-Catholic massacres in Ulster were by far his biggest priority. On the 16th of June, an election was held that showed a majority of people were in favour of the treaty. Pro-treaty candidates won over 78% of the vote, but the anti-treatyites refused to accept it, and accused Collins of sabotaging the vote. This was all going on while the anti-treaty forces continued to occupy the Dublin buildings. But any hopes of reconciliation was destroyed when Sir Henry Wilson was sprayed with bullets outside his front door in broad daylight in London. Wilson's death was absolutely monumental and nearly single-handedly annihilated all Irish-British relations, and for a couple of days it genuinely looked like an all-out war could happen between the Irish and British. One of the reasons for Wilson's death was to unite the IRA behind a figure who they both detested, but in reality it did the complete polar opposite, as the anti-treaty forces were blamed by Churchill and Lloyd George, who sent a letter to Collins saying the anti-treaty forces could no longer be ignored by the British government, and if Collins continued to tolerate this behaviour, the treaty would be automatically executed, and British forces would launch a full-scale invasion of Ireland. Churchill was absolutely furious at Wilson's death, and launched a roaring speech in the House of Commons, implying they would invade Ireland once again. Collins' reaction to Churchill's speech was even more furious. He was now put between a rock and a hard place. He couldn't ignore the anti-treaty forces because that would mean British troops returning to Ireland, but also knew if he attacked them with British weaponry, he would be seen as a traitor and a British agent. Another simple reason for the death of Henry Wilson was the Catholic massacres in Ulster. In 2 years, from June 1920 to June 1922, in Ulster alone, the numbers are astonishing. Frankly, it's actually quite a miracle Henry Wilson was not eliminated sooner. His name was on the hit list just before the truce, a year previous. It's hard to wager whether Collins did directly order the hit on Wilson. One of his generals, Joseph Sweeney, said Collins was delighted when he heard the news, but this doesn't necessarily mean he ordered it. Both Emmett Dalton and Ernest Blythe said separately that Collins did not directly order it. On the anti-treaty side, De Valera and Rory O'Connor were both adamant they did not order it either. De Valera said although he didn't have anything to do with it, he can't act like he doesn't know why it happened, considering the horrors happening up in Ulster. 4 days after Wilson's death, pro-treaty forces arrested anti-treaty officer Leo Henderson, and in response the same day, anti-treaty forces captured Ginger O'Connell and held him hostage inside the forecourts. Nevertheless, Wilson's death was absolutely the last straw for the British government, and they were not playing the waiting game with Collins anymore. He was given 2 clear choices: Irishmen with British weaponry, or British men with British weaponry. The chances of a British invasion was growing literally by the hour at this point, and Collins decided the lesser of 2 evils was to use his British weaponry himself. He couldn't risk the British coming back as peacekeepers. As he wrote in his own words, quote, "Not that the English would have come back, that would indeed have been terrible enough, but that they would have been welcomed back, that they would have come not as enemies, but as the only protectors who could bring order and peace." Following this logic, Collins told Churchill to send over the British weaponry, and he did so. And so on the 28th of June, at 3:40 a.m, Collins gave his former friends a warning to leave the forecourts. The anti-treaty forces sent no reply, and instead knelt down to pray the rosary in Irish. At 4:07 a.m, Collins ordered his troops to open fire on the forecourts, and the Civil War had officially gone to the next level. A sick, frail old Arthur Griffith stood on the roof of another nearby building, watching his fellow Irishmen turn on each other after going through so much together. As the fires raged, Griffith looked up at the thick black smoke over Dublin, shaking his fist, shouting and cursing De Valera. Collins, being ever meticulous, realised the uniforms would be hard to come by in the coming weeks, and so he called to Vaughan's Hotel to collect them, a place where he had so many memories with his men over the last 4 years. He went in there only to find someone else had the same idea, his old friend Harry Boland. It was the last time they ever saw each other. 2 days later, on the 30th of June at 3:30 p.m, the anti-treaty forces succumbed to the superior British weaponry, and nearly identical to the men of 1916, they stepped out of the government buildings, waving a white handkerchief tied to a broom handle. Ernie O'Malley signed the unconditional surrender and threw his gun into the River Liffey in anger. Dublin city centre was left in ruins for the second time in 6 years, with at least 35 dead and over 100 wounded. De Valera got away in a Red Cross ambulance, while Cathal Brugha was eliminated after charging right into pro-treaty forces, and he died that night in hospital. The man who detested Collins never lived to see him die. But Collins, being an emotional man, cried that night hearing the news. He wrote to a friend that he forgave Brugha for everything he did, and apparently Brugha himself had softened towards the end. But this was no match for the heartache he would suffer over his best friend. Earlier that month, Collins broke his silence to Harry Boland and wrote in a letter, quote, "Harry, it has come to this. Of all things it has come to this. It is in my power to arrest you and destroy you. This I cannot do. If you think over to the influence which has dominated you, it shall change your mind. You are walking under false colours. If no words of mine will change your attitude, then you are beyond all hope. My hope." Of course, they both knew who that influence dominating him was. He had a 6'4" shadow hanging over him. On the 31st of July, Harry Boland was in his hotel bedroom when pro-treaty forces stormed in. Unarmed, he tried to get away, but to no avail, and was shot by an inexperienced soldier who didn't finish him off properly and ran away. Boland lay there in agony, bleeding for hours, before he was found and taken to St. Vincent's Hospital. Collins was furious and immediately sought updates of his condition and ordered an officer to make regular reports on how he was doing. On his deathbed, Boland's sister Kathleen begged him to tell her who shot him, but he refused to say. 3 nights later, Harry Boland died. Fiona Lynch recalled he was sleeping in his bedroom when Collins burst in bawling crying. His best friend was dead, all because he couldn't see eye to eye. He wrote to Kitty, quote, "Last night I passed St. Vincent's Hospital, and saw a small crowd outside, my mind went into him lying dead there, and I thought of the times together, and whatever good there is in any wish of mine, he certainly had it. Although the gap of 8 or 9 months was not forgotten, of course no one can ever forget it, I only thought of him with the friendship of the days in 1918 and 1919. I'd send a reed, but I suppose they've returned it torn up. That was Michael Collins. That was him summed up. Beneath all the toughness, all the hard man image, he was still a soft, emotional man deep down. Frank O'Connor said he couldn't list all the times he saw Collins cry, and he saw no problem in doing so. He had an iron fist, but a warm heart. It can be easy to forget these were all real men who loved each other, but were forced into an unnecessary war which, considering Ireland today, was completely pointless. A week afterwards, Collins officially became the most powerful man in the country, when he became Commander-in-Chief of the Free State Army, and therefore in charge of a significant amount of the country. He temporarily stepped down as head of the provisional government, and gave the role to W.T. Cosgrave, so while out of his governmental duties, he moved into his quarters at Mallow Barracks in Cork. Funny enough, Kitty Kiernan didn't seem to have any understanding of Collins' military life. She wrote to him that week, quote, "You are seeing chief now. What does this mean? More trouble, I suppose. Will it ever end? But God is good." He took a great interest in styling his army after other European nations, in particular Switzerland. As we see in one letter to Ginger O'Connell, he wanted an Irish equivalent of the Swiss Citizens' Army. He also looked for inspiration to other small European nations, like Denmark, who he saw as a successful agricultural-based economy. He made sure no drink would ever touch the lips of any soldier in uniform, and he made it a strict military order. Even in the midst of a civil war, he still worked all hours of the night, making reports in the tiniest details. Just 3 weeks before he died, he wrote to the Quartermaster General about how the mattresses needed to be cleaner. He kept up all these tiny details till the day he died. By the summer, most of the country was effectively being run by these 3 men: Collins, Richard Mulcahy, and Owen O'Duffy, as part of a 3-man military council, with Mulcahy being Chief of Staff and O'Duffy being Assistant Chief of Staff. Harry Boland's death was only the beginning. On the 12th of August, his old mentor Arthur Griffith died of a brain hemorrhage. Collins was making a round of inspections when the news reached him down in Tralee in County Kerry. He went to Dublin for Griffith's funeral at Glasnevin Cemetery on the 16th, but it was a day of triple mourning, as the men who eliminated Henry Wilson, Reggie Dunn and Joseph O'Sullivan were also hung the same day. Tens of thousands of people attended Arthur Griffith's funeral to pay their respects to the founder of Sinn Féin and the co-signatory of the treaty. Collins helped carry Griffith's coffin, and at the graveside he gave a speech where he spoke in defence of the treaty and assured everyone it was the best they could have fought for. As the crowd dispersed, he stared down at Griffith's grave for an unusually long amount of time. Bishop Fogarty walked over and said rather grimly, "Michael, you should be prepared. You might be next." He said, "I know." They were right. He would be in a coffin in 6 days.
A black August day in the county Cork, Michael Collins is dead. Hang out your brightest colours, his memory now recall. Oh, each one wants a part of him, no one wants it all.
So what did happen the day Michael Collins died? Originally the reason I made this video, and one I will make in detail later on. Many debates are had about Collins' final days, but one fact everyone agrees on is he was in horrific health, which made his life misery. The stress of a civil war, plus the deaths of Boland and Griffith and others, took its toll in the form of either a stomach ulcer or appendicitis. Collins was not stupid, and he knew himself the walls were closing in, and every day was a bonus at this point. He said to W.T. Cosgrave, who would end up succeeding him, "Do you think I shall live through all this? Not likely." He would often joke to his secretaries, "How would you like a new boss?" To which they didn't find much humour. Many stories differ about his final days. Even the expert historians disagree on the details. But what we do know is, on the 22nd of August 1922, Michael Collins' final day began at 6 a.m. when he woke up in the Imperial Hotel in Cork City. It was one of the dates he and Kitty had discussed as a wedding date. The bells at Holy Trinity Church were ringing. Collins crossed himself, knelt down and prayed. He had been to confession just a few days earlier. Christianity was always important to him. He set out on his rounds of inspections, as he'd been doing the last few days, with Ginger O'Connell and Emmett Dalton and a few others. His decision to go touring Cork earlier in the week shocked his Director of Intelligence, Joe McGrath, who wrote a letter in red ink warning him to not go down there, as there are many anti-treaty strongholds in West Cork. But Collins was adamant to go. He wrote to McGrath, possibly his most famous quote, "You're sure, they'd never kill me in my own county." Many have also said peace talks were a reason behind his journey to West Cork, and he was looking to meet any anti-treaty leaders and put an end to all this. In particular, he hoped to meet his old chief, Valera, who slept in a farmhouse at Beal Blath the night before. Another rumour is he was on a mission to recover over 100 grand worth of gold stolen from the IRB. One of his men, Sean McOwen, said by then there were loose plans of peace talks, and the anti-treatyites had sent all the locations of landmines and mined bridges so Collins could reach them safely. This would help to explain the ridiculously small escort Collins had travelling around with him. At 8 a.m. they reached Macroom, where they met with pro-treaty forces. An hour later they set off for West Cork, where they passed through a lonely country road called Beal na Blath, meaning Mouth of the Flowers. They made a mistake of asking someone for directions to Bandon, who turned out to be anti-treaty. Word went round like wildfire that the big fella was in the area, and so the anti-treaty forces dotted themselves round Beal na Blath, hoping Collins' convoy would return in the same direction. Now was their time. After Bandon, they made their way down to his hometown of Clonakilty, then down to Rosscarbery, and then down to Skibbereen, famously a town devastated by the Great Famine. After lunch in Skibbereen, they left homeward bound around 4:30 p.m, through Rosscarbery, and then through Woodfield near Clonakilty where he grew up. As they passed through Woodfield, he nudged Emmett Dalton and pointed at his home. "There," he said, "there is where I was born. That was my home." It was the last time he ever saw it. The convoy then stopped at his local pub a few miles away. Collins walked into the pub, smiled at all the familiar faces and said, "How's everyone?" It's not known how many drinks Collins and his men had. Emmett Dalton insists they were sober, but of course it's only presumable they had a few. As for how drunk they actually were, we'll never know. Collins met his cousin Michael O'Brien and Jura Collins, and asked him how his brother Johnny was doing, before walking over to his aunt, who was sitting by the fire. She grabbed his huge hand with her two small hands, and pleaded with him to be safe. He brushed it off as usual and said he'll be fine. His cousin Michael O'Brien said Collins was a rogue his whole life. He was always a boy deep down, like Peter Pan, a favourite of his. And even that last day he met him, he said it seemed like Collins wants to have a good wrestling match right there and then. After a while, his brother Johnny made it to the pub, and like everyone else, warned Collins to be safe. He just laughed it off. It's said that two farmers at Beal na Blath got into a fight with the ambush party after they tried to remove a barricade on the road. One of the farmers was a relation of Collins, and so he sent his son to the local pub to tell the pub owner, Paddy, that if he saw Michael, to warn him it was too dangerous around there. And so Paddy told him in the pub. Once again, he completely brushed it off, saying, "Yeah, sure, they'd never kill me." A far cry from the man he once was. If he had that attitude in Dublin fighting the Black and Tans, he'd have been dead in a week. Being in his home county, and not fully realising how bloodthirsty the anti-treatyites were, was ultimately his downfall. It was the first time in years he had his guard down. They then left the pub and drove through the fields of Clonakilty, avoiding the roads in case he was spotted, and headed north up to Bandon. Here, the last ever photo was taken of him. He met his old trusted friend Sean Hales, telling him to, quote, "keep up the good work." As he said goodbye to Sean, at that exact time this photo was taken, they had no idea Sean's brother, Tom Hales, was lying in a field just 20 minutes down the road, waiting for Collins' blood. He would be dead just an hour after this photo. He told Emmett Dalton on the journey that day it was a shame Tom Hales had switched sides, because he was an awfully good soldier. A few months previous, Collins said in a newspaper interview, quote, "I'd rather have Tom Hales with us than 20 others," end quote. He also spoke highly of his other West Cork neighbour, Liam Deasy. Both men would lead to his death in just an hour's time. By now it was around 7:30 p.m. Dusk was setting in, and light was just beginning to fall. The ambush party had been waiting so long, they figured Collins must have taken a different route home. Most left, leaving only a handful of men determined to stay. And so, this was it. Michael Collins had taken on an empire that ruled 25% of the world. British soldiers, RIC policemen, intelligence officers, agents, spies, informers, politicians, auxiliaries, Black and Tans, all the while being the most wanted man on planet Earth. All had succumbed to him, but all it took to take down the invincible Michael J. Collins was a few of his former friends hiding in a ditch on a lonely country road in his home county. Collins and his men left Bandon and foolishly drove back the same route they came. Emmett Dalton remembers Collins picking up his rifle before anything even happened. Perhaps it was instinct. As they came around the bend, they stopped at a barricade in the middle of the road and shots were fired. Emmett Dalton, with all his military experience, was the first to realise there was no way this could end well, and shouted at the driver to, quote, "drive like hell." But this was Michael Collins we're talking about. A man who used to tackle gunmen right in front of him to the ground and disarm them. There was no way he was going to run away with his tail between his legs on his home soil. He ordered his men to get out and fight. He put his hand on the driver's shoulder and shouted, "Stop, jump out and we'll fight them." The situation was almost certain to fail for Collins and his men down below. Firing upwards into a ditch, with little to no shelter except for the cars, was a death sentence. Collins spent most of the fighting behind the armoured car, firing above him and to his left, before he saw a couple of the anti-treaty men retreating and running through the field. And with all his fighting spirit, he decided to run up the road and follow them. Again, this is a man who thought he was invincible, destined to never die. He dashed out from behind the armoured car, alone, and all of a sudden, he was out from behind a little shelter he already had. He ran up a few yards to gain a better view of the enemy, completely vulnerable, exposed and alone. And then there was a sound that would change Irish history forever. Ireland's Commander-in-Chief, Michael John Collins, was dead.
At what stage then did you learn that he'd been hit?
Well, I thought I heard a voice calling me. And I jumped up, and at that stage O'Connell had come up the road to me. And he said, "Where's the big fellow?" So I said, "He's round the corner, around the bend." And we both went up there, and he had been shot. He was lying there with a very gaping wound in the back of his head. So I called the armoured car back, and under protection of the armoured car, we bandaged the wound. I bandaged the wound, and O'Connell said an act of contrition to him. I knew he was dying, if not already dead. So we did the best we could to.
Did he talk to you at any time after he'd been hit?
No.
You felt he was dying?
I felt he was either dying or dead at the time that I reached him. We were both very upset, as you can well understand, emotionally. And we moved Collins's body from the armoured car situation onto the touring car back, and I sat in and carried his weight on my shoulder in the car when we drove off back towards our home base of Cork.
Of Cork City?
Yes. Personally, I was holding the body of the Commander-in-Chief in my arms, and the rest of the cortege was moving ahead as best they could. And it was a sad, sad journey.
All in all, the fighting lasted only around half an hour, but it was a half hour that would haunt the men for the rest of their lives. What followed was an absolute nightmare. The journey to Cork City was only 19 miles, but they didn't reach there until 1:30 a.m. due to all the trenches, blown up bridges, and in fact by then it was night time, and there was barely anyone around to ask for directions. After meeting with a priest to give him his last rites, they headed for the hospital. Near Cork City, they turned into a cul-de-sac and entered a farmyard by mistake. They then had to drive through a field, trying to reconnect onto the road, before they got stuck in the field. So they had no choice but to carry the Commander-in-Chief's corpse on their shoulders. The brains of what was an incredible mind just a few hours ago seeping onto the shoulders of his men. His body eventually reached Shannakeil Hospital, but of course there was nothing they could do. Ireland's greatest ever son was dead. 6 days later, one of the biggest funerals in history took place. Over 500,000 people came to pay their respects to their Commander-in-Chief, about 20% of the country's entire population. More people attended Michael Collins' funeral than Abraham Lincoln's. Many of his men gave speeches at his funeral, like Richard Mulcahy, who succeeded him as Commander-in-Chief, and Eoin O'Duffy, who later unveiled his memorial at Beal na Blath. The Civil War was eventually won by the pro-treaty side. All in all, over 2,000 Irishmen were killed by their fellow Irishmen, with damages amounting to over £50 million. Indeed, it is a fact that no other Irishman has ever reached the same levels of love from the Irish people as Michael Collins, nor did the country's support for the IRA ever reach the same levels since his war against the Black and Tans. To this day, his grave is the most visited in the country, and flowers are placed there nearly daily. It's not an exaggeration to say Michael Collins is the most loved Irishman who's ever lived. Everyone who took part in the Beal na Blath ambush regretted it years later. Liam Deasy, who helped organise the ambush, said poetically, quote, "Many of us left Murray's with heavy hearts. To those who had known Collins personally, and there are many, his death was tragic. We parted without discussion of any kind, each of us all too conscious of the tragedy and the loneliness that only time could heal." He later said in his book on the Civil War, Brother Against Brother, that Collins was, quote, "the greatest leader of our generation." Of course, on the pro-treaty side, the reaction was even worse. Emmett Dalton's brother, Charlie, remembers Collins' cousin, Garrod O'Sullivan, opening his bedroom door at Portobello Barracks. Quote, "He did not greet me customarily, but stood rather bewildered looking for a second or two, and then broke down weeping. 'Charlie, the big fella's dead.' Garrod was planned to have a double wedding with Collins, as he was marrying Kitty's sister, Maud. Another huge question that still lingers to this day is, did De Valera have anything to do with Collins' death? We don't know for certain, and it's most likely we'll never know. It is true, De Valera was around Beal na Blath and slept in the farmhouse the night before Collins died. But even if he was in the area, it doesn't necessarily mean he ordered it. It is said by one of his aides-de-camp, Jimmy Flynn, that Dev actively tried to prevent it, but was told since he only held the position of staff officer in the army, his orders were futile. Another one of Dev's men said on the night of Collins' death, Dev was, quote, "furious and visibly upset." Of course, there's a chance this is just his friends protecting his legacy. The truth is, we'll never know for certain. There was no last-minute confessions from anyone on their deathbed. But when Dev came to power in 1932, he began deconstructing the treaty for the next 2 decades, and decided to accept the oath to the king, saying it didn't matter, as it was just a meaningless set of words. Many wondered how much pain and suffering could have been avoided if he had the same mindset a decade prior. Nevertheless, he began deconstructing the treaty to the point where Ireland left the Commonwealth and became a republic in 1949, thereby vindicating Michael Collins that it was a stepping stone to a republic. This led De Valera to famously say, quote, "History will record the greatness of Michael Collins, and it will be recorded at my expense." Tom Hales regretted Beal na Blath for the rest of his life, and is said to have, quote, "cried his eyes out," and even set an incredible standard by making peace with Michael's brother Johnny and his wife Nancy, and apologised to the both of them, to which they accepted. Hales later said, quote, "I loved him like a brother, and I taught a lot of my brothers." The morning after the ambush, Hales and 2 others went back to Beal na Blath to inspect the scene, only to find Collins' blood-stained cap on the side of the road. Hales picked up the cap and buried it beneath a nearby tree, and the 3 men stood in silence, praying. In 1965, anti-treaty veterans like Tom Hales, Tom Barry and Liam Deasy met with Collins' men, including Vinnie Byrne, to unveil Collins' memorial by his local pub at Sam's Cross, where Tom Barry said nobody did more for the cause of Irish independence than Michael Collins. Jim Hurley, who was at the ambush as well, also apologised to Johnny and Nancy, to which they also accepted, before breaking down in tears right in front of them. How could we do it? We were too young. I was only 19. Amazingly, Jim Hurley and Johnny went back to being the closest of friends, and a few months before Hurley's death, he requested he be buried next to Johnny, and they both lie aside one another today at Clonakilty Graveyard. So who did kill Michael Collins? Undoubtedly, it was Sonny O'Neill, an ex-British Army soldier. Tom Hales told Johnny Collins, in secret, it was Sonny O'Neill who took Michael's life, but even he regretted it too. In 1950, Sonny O'Neill came down with a terminal heart condition and contacted Tom Hales to ask about Johnny's attitude to the ambush. Hales told O'Neill that Johnny had forgiven all of them. O'Neill died a few weeks later. It's possible he was looking to apologise to Johnny before he died, but he never got the chance. Aside from his men who loved him, many using that exact word, certainly the most distraught was poor Miss Kitty Kiernan, whose life became something of an emotional wasteland after he died. For years she cried her eyes out, reading and rereading his letters. She did eventually settle down with one of Collins' men, Felix Cronin, but it's said to have been a loveless marriage, more practical than anything else. She never stopped loving Michael, to the point where they named their second son Michael Collins Cronin, and she had his portrait hanging in their living room. Felix knew, of course, that Kitty's heart belonged to Michael, and when she died in 1945, he granted her wish to have her buried next to the man she loved in Glasnevin Cemetery, and today she lie beside Michael Collins. But Michael and Kitty were deeply religious. Their letters contained many references to prayer, church and communion. Her last ever letter to him suggested that once the fighting was over, they should go on a pilgrimage to Loch Derg. Christianity was always important to both of them. Near the end of his life, P.S. O'Hegarty asked Collins what it actually is he fought for. Collins wasn't sure how to answer this. He stopped for a second, paused, and said with many more pauses in between, "I stand for an Irish civilization, based on the people and embodying and maintaining the things, their habits, ways of thought, customs that make them different, the sort of life I was brought up in." This might seem very vague and basic, but then he said something very interesting. Once, years ago, a crowd of us were going along the Shepherd's Bush Road, when out of lane came a chap with a donkey, just the sort of donkey, and just the sort of cart they have at home. He came out quite suddenly, and abruptly we all cheered him. Nobody who has not been in exile will understand me, but I stand for that. There's a lot you can say about the Commander-in-Chief, Michael Collins. Was he too harsh, too soft? Was he right or wrong? But one thing you can never, ever, ever say about him is he didn't love Ireland with all his heart. And there's not one single politician in Ireland today you can say the same thing about. Because one can't help but wonder what Mr. Collins' reaction would be if he saw Ireland today. Well, thank you for watching. As I'm sure you can imagine, this video took quite a while to make and quite a blood, sweat and tears. So I appreciate anyone who likes, comments, subscribes and supports these videos. Thank you.